The Source by James Michener. This is a novel. Its characters and scenes are imaginary except as noted. The hero, Rabbi Akiba, was a real man who died as described in 137 CE. All quotations ascribed to him can be verified. King David and Apishag, Herod the Great and his family, General Petronius, Emperor Vespasian, General Josephus, and Dr. Maimonides were also real persons, and quotations ascribed to the last are also verifiable. Acca, Ziphat, and Tiberias are existing places in the Galilee, and descriptions of these towns are accurate. But Makor, its site, its history, and its excavation are wholly imaginary. The tell of Makor at site 17072584 in western Galilee, as seen by archaeologists on Sunday morning, May 3rd, 1964, while standing in the olive grove to the south. From the visual appearance of the tell, nothing could be deduced as to its genesis, construction, or history, except that the uniformly smooth surface of the slope would suggest that at some time around the year 1700 BCE, it could have been paved with heavy stone blocks by Hyksos invaders moving against Egypt from the north, and the slight rise toward the eastern side of the tell might indicate that there had once been a building of some size standing at that point. On Tuesday, the freighter steamed through the Straits of Gibraltar and for 5 days plowed eastward through the Mediterranean, past islands and peninsulas rich in history, so that on Saturday night the steward advised Dr. Cullinan, "If you wish an early sight of the Holy Land, you must be up at dawn." The steward was Italian and was reluctant to use the name Israel. For him, good Catholic that he was, it would always be the Holy Land. Some time before dawn, Cullinan heard a rapping on his door and went on deck while the stars were still bright. But as the moon fell away toward areas he had left, the sun began to rise over the land he was seeking, and the crown of stars that hung over Israel glimmered fitfully and faded. The shoreline became visible, mauve hills in the gray dawn, and he saw 3 things he knew. To the left, the white Muslim mosque of Akko, in the center, the golden dome of the Baha'i temple, and to the right, high on a hill, the brown battlements of the Catholic Carmelites. Just like the Jews, he said, denied religious liberty by all, they extend it to everyone. He thought that might be a good motto for the new state, but as the freighter approached land, he added, "I'd feel more like a traveler to Israel if they'd let me see one good synagogue." But the Jewish religion was an internal thing, a system for organizing life rather than building edifices, and no Jewish religious structures were visible. Even at the dockside, his introduction to the Jewish state was postponed, for the first man who recognized him was a genial, good-looking Arab in his late 30s, dressed natively in Western clothes, who called from the shore in English, "Welcome, welcome, everything's ready." 2 generations of British and American archaeologists had been greeted with this heartening call, either by the present Jamil Tabari or by his famous uncle Mahmoud, who had worked on most of the historic digs in the area. Dr. Cullinan, from the Biblical Museum in Chicago, was reassured. For many years, he had dreamed of excavating one of the silent mounds in the Holy Land, perhaps even to uncover additional clues to the history of man and his gods as they interacted in this ancient land. As he waited for the freighter to tie up, he looked across the bay to Akka, that jewel of a seaport, where so much of the history he was about to probe had started. Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, and finally Richard the Lionheart and his crusaders had all come to that harbor in glorious panoply, and to follow in their footsteps was, for an archaeologist like Cullinan, a privilege. A privilege. I hope I do a good job, he whispered. As soon as he cleared the papers for the ponderous amount of equipment stored in the freighter, the books, the chemicals, the photographic equipment, the little diesel locomotive, the thousand things a layman would not think of, he ran down the gangplank and embraced Tabari, and the Arab reported, "Things couldn't be going better. Dr. Varel will be here shortly. The other Americans are already dug in, and the photographer is flying down from London this afternoon." "Weather been good?" Cullinane asked. He was a lean, tall man, just entering his 40s, an Irish Catholic educated at Harvard and Grenoble, with excavation experience in Arizona, Egypt, and the area south of Jerusalem. Under normal circumstances, it would have been unlikely for a Catholic to head such a dig, for the earlier field directors of the Biblical Museum had usually been Protestant clergymen. But the bulk of the money for this particular dig had come from a Chicago Jew who had said, "Isn't it about time we had a professional doing the work?" And Cullinane had been agreed upon, particularly since he spoke Hebrew, a little Arabic, and French. He was the crop-headed type of new scholar, solidly trained and not given to nonsense. On his departure from Chicago, loaded with gear, he had been asked by a newspaperman if he expected to dig up any records which would prove that the Bible was true. Cullinane replied, "No, we're not out to help God steady the ark." The impudent reply had been widely quoted, but when the businessman who had put up the $250,000 for the dig saw the wisecrack, he felt reassured that his money was in sober hands. "Weather's flawless," the Arab replied, speaking with the fluent ease of a man whose father had been Sir Tufik Tabari, OBE, KBE, one of the Arab leaders whom the British had trusted. Sir Tufik had sent his son to Oxford, hoping that he would want to follow him in the civil service, but the boy had been from the first enchanted by his uncle Mahmud's work in digging up history, and his professors at Oxford had turned him into a first-rate scientific archaeologist. In the winter of 1948, when the Jews threatened to capture Palestine from the Arabs, young Jamal, then 22, had debated a long time as to what he should do. He ended by making a typical Tabari choice. He stayed in Akko and fought the Jews vigorously. Then, when his haphazard army was crushed, he announced that he would not seek asylum in Egypt or Syria. He would stay in Israel, where he had always lived, and would work with the Jews to rebuild the war-torn land. As a result of this bold decision, he found himself popular and almost the only trained Arab available for the many archaeological excavations that were proliferating throughout the country. His presence at any site meant that the highest scientific standards would be enforced and that the good spirits would be preserved among the workmen, who said of him, "Jamil once dug 20 feet straight down using only a camel's hairbrush." As the two friends talked, a jeep squealed its brakes outside the customs area, and the driver, a petite young woman in her mid-30s, jumped out and ran past the persisting guard to give Cullinane a leaping kiss. "Shalom, John. It's so wonderful to have you back." She was Dr. Vered Bar-El, Israel's top expert in dating pottery shards, and without her assistance, Dr. Cullinane's dig could not succeed, for she had the unusual capacity to memorize the scores of scientific reports issued during the 20th century, so that whenever someone like Cullinane or Tabari handed her a fragment of pottery, a sherd left by some household accident that had occurred 7,000 years ago, she could usually look at the piece, then summon from her extraordinary memory pieces of similar construction found in Egypt or Jericho or Beit Mersin. Archaeologists of 5 countries called her our walking calendar, and the commendable thing about her work was that when she did not know, she said so. She was a small woman, beautiful, bright-eyed, a pleasure to have at any dig. She was also one of the first major experts who had been trained wholly in Israel. When the state came into being in 1948, she was but 17 and had later attended Hebrew University in Jerusalem. "Leave the gear where it is," she said with a musical Hebrew accent. "I brought along 2 of the crew, and they'll stand guard till it's unloaded. Right now, let's head for the dig. I'm hungry to get started." She led Cullinane to the jeep, and with deft turns of the wheel, soon had him on the ancient road that led from Akko to Zefat, and beyond that to Damascus, the capital of Syria. As they entered this classic road, for some 5,000 years, a major east-west artery through which had flowed the contributions of Asia on their way to Venice and Genoa, Cullinane took pains to orient himself. Could you stop the jeep for a moment? He asked Mrs. Burrell. I'm sorry, but if I get mixed up at the start, I never get straightened out later. He got out of the jeep, studied his field map, turned firmly toward the direction from which they had come, and said, Straight ahead to the west is Akko and the Mediterranean. To my right, the Crusader castle of Starkenburg. To my left, Jerusalem. Behind me, to the east, the Sea of Galilee. And if you continue in the direction the car's headed, you'll reach Zafat, and far beyond it, Damascus, right? Roger, over, Debar said, but he thought it strange that in the Holy Land a man should orient himself by facing away from Jerusalem. For some miles, the riders discussed the coming dig and the allocations of work that had been agreed upon. The photographer coming down from London is excellent, Cullinane assured his colleagues. Chap who did such good work at Jericho. And our architect is top-notch. University of Pennsylvania. I haven't seen any drawings done by the girl you've chosen for draftsman. Is she capable? She was good enough for Yigal Yadin at Hazor, Dr. Barrell explained. Oh, that the girl. How'd you get her? We're training some great artists in this country, the little pottery expert said. And Cullinane thought, I must remember to titillate their national pride. I must. Aloud he said, if we've got the girl who did the artwork for Hazor, we're lucky. We are lucky, Dr. Barrell said, almost defensively. Now all grew quiet as they neared the point from which the mound to be excavated would first be seen. Cullinane leaned forward, tense with excitement. To the north, substantial hills appeared, and from time unremembered, they had protected this road from the marauders of Lebanon. To the south, matching hills were beginning to rise, offering security in that direction. A small valley was thus being formed, and along its northern edge, short, sharp fingers of rock jutted out like opened hands, warding off anyone who might want to attack the ancient lifeline along which so much wealth had traveled. Dr. Barrell turned a corner, straightened out the jeep, and drove for a few minutes. Then it loomed ahead, the mysterious target. It was Makor, a barren, elliptical mound, standing at the foot of one of the projecting spurs and rising high in the air. It was difficult to believe that it was real, for it had two strange characteristics. Its top plateau was quite flat, as if some giant hand had smoothed it down, and the visible flanks of the mound were perfect earthen slopes, each a glacis 45 degrees in angle, as if the same monstrous hand had stuck out a finger to round off the edges. It looked unnatural, like a fortress without walls, and this impression was augmented by the harsh, rocky spur that rose to the rear, by the hills that rose behind that, and by the rugged mountains which backed up everything. The mound was thus the terminal point of a chain of fortifications, the lowest of four descending steps, and it was perfectly placed both for its own protection and for guarding the important road that passed its feet. Its full name was Tel Makor, which signified that the local citizens knew it was not a natural mound, laid down by tectonic forces, but the patiently accumulated residue of one abandoned settlement after another, each resting upon the ruins of its predecessor, reaching endlessly back into history. From the bare rock on which the first community of Makor had been built to the grassy top was 71 feet, made up of fallen bricks, ruptured stone walls, broken turrets, bits of prehistoric flint, and most valuable of all, the fragments of pottery that would, when washed and inspected by Dr. Barrell, tell the story of this solemn yet exciting spot. We've picked the best to tell in the country, Dr. Cullinane assured his team, and he took from his briefcase the preliminary maps made from aerial photographs in which a grid of rectangular squares, 10 meters to the side, had been superimposed upon the tell. And at that moment, the three archaeologists in the jeep could feel that their will was being imposed upon the mound and would finally squeeze from its secret inner places the remnants of the once vital existence. Yesterday, Tel Makor had been a beautiful elliptical mound sleeping on the road from Akko to Damascus. Today, it was a carefully plotted target where not one pickaxe would be applied aimlessly. Let's check with the 1,000th Palestine map, Cullinane suggested, and Tabari unfolded a section of the beautiful map drafted 10 years ago by British engineers. On it, the two men made calculations which zeroed in the location of Tel Makor so that other archaeologists around the world could accurately identify it. Henceforth, the site of their labors would be 17072584, in which the first four numbers indicated the east-west orientation and the last four the north-south. In Israel, in Asia, in the world, there could be no other spot like this. And when the superimposed layers of earth had been penetrated one by one, the world would be able to say, with some exactitude, what had happened at 17072584. It was the meticulous recreation of that history which would occupy John Colnan and his skilled crew for the ensuing years. He put aside the maps and jumped from the jeep. With long strides, he climbed the steep glacis and finally swung onto the plateau, some 200 yards long by 130 wide. Somewhere in this mound, he would start his men digging, and to a disagreeable extent, the success or failure of the first years would depend upon how cannily he had chosen. For archaeologists had been known to select their spots without luck and to dig through fruitless levels, while others coming later to the same tell, but with superior insight, had quickly found rewarding layers one after another. He hoped he would be one of the lucky ones. Deciding where to start, Tabari asked as he reached the plateau. The Irishman waited for Dr. Bar-El, then said, I'm like Sir Flinders Petrie. He organized his digs on the principle that if you command 100 different communities to build towns on 100 different mounds, more than 90 will place their major buildings in the northwest area. Why, nobody knows. Possibly because of the sunsets. So naturally, I'm inclined toward the northwest, and we can dump our rubble over here. He pointed to the northern edge of the plateau, from which the archaeologists could look down into something not visible from the road, a precipitous gully, called throughout the east a wadi, whose cliff-like sides had always protected Makor from armies seeking to establish a siege from the north. The wadi was deep enough to absorb rubble from the entire tell, should any millionaire have enough money to pay for such a total excavation. The dig at Makor, as planned by Colnan, would require 10 years at a cost of $50,000 a year, and since he had in hand funds only for the first 5 years, it was essential that he quickly uncover areas of interest. For he had found that people who finance archaeological digs can be depended upon for additional funds if their interest is sustained through the first year, whereas they quickly close their checkbooks if no fines are forthcoming. It was therefore crucial that he locate his trial trenches in the right spots, for even after he had spent 10 years uncovering selected levels, his team would still have excavated less than 15% of the site. As he had explained to his board in Chicago, our educated guess is that in this tell, we may have the remains of about 20 different layers of civilizations. You must understand that for me to peel these off, one by one, in proper scientific style, until nothing is left but the original perimeter, would require about 50 years. What we'll do is sink 2 short exploratory trenches down through all the layers. That'll take a year, but when we're through, we'll know in general what's at hand. Then in subsequent years, if we get the funds, we'll go back and dig more deeply in selected areas that promise returns. But bear with me if I repeat that we cannot possibly uncover the entire tell. What we can uncover is a picture of what happened there, and it's that we're after. Isn't it pretty important where you locate those first trenches? A member had asked. That's what I'll sweat about for the next 6 months, he had replied. And now the moment was at hand when he must make the critical decision. As he stood that morning on top of the tell, whose secrets he must probe, he was no ordinary man, come to the Holy Land with enthusiasm and a shovel. He had won the title archaeologist only at the end of a long period of subtle training. At Harvard, he had learned to read Aramaic, Arabic, and ancient Hebrew scripts. During graduate work with Professor Albright at Johns Hopkins, he had mastered Mesopotamian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs until he could read them as an average man reads a newspaper. He had taken off a year to attend Carnegie Tech for advanced work in metallurgy, so that he would be able to identify with some certainty the provenience and smelting processes of local metals and their alloys. Later, he had spent 3 winter terms at Ohio State University taking advanced ceramics, precisely as if he intended making cups and saucers for the rest of his life. And from this experience, had trained himself to guess within 100 degrees centigrade the furnace heat at which any given piece of ancient pottery had been fired. He knew less of the historical relationships of ceramics than a real specialist like Dr. Barrell, but in technical analysis he excelled her. Following these scientific courses, he had lived for a year in New York, studying costume and armor at the Metropolitan Museum, and for another year, one of the best of his life, in the little French university town of Grenoble, specializing in prehistory and the cave art of France. Coincident with his work among the Indians of Arizona, he had attended summer sessions at the State University, working on problems of dendrochronology, whereby time sequences in desert areas could be established by comparing the wide rings left in wood by growing seasons which had enjoyed heavy rainfall and the narrow ones left by years of drought. This was followed by a full year at Princeton, enrolled in Presbyterian Seminary, where he worked with experts on problems of Bible research. But as often happens, one of his most valuable skills he picked up by himself. As a boy, he had found pleasure in collecting stamps. Perhaps he was now an archaeologist because of this accident of his childhood. But his Irish father used to growl, "What are you doing with them stamps?" He did not know, but when he became a man, he vaguely sensed that he ought not to be fooling around with bits of paper, and in some fortunate way, he shifted to coins, what seemed more respectable, and this field of specialization was to prove of great value in biblical research. He had written one of the papers which had helped prove that there had been two issues of Jewish shekels, one used in the initial Jewish revolt led by Judah the Maccabee, 166 years before Christ, and a second minted during the final revolt of Bar Kokhba, 135 years after Christ. As a result of this paper, he was known as a numismatic expert. All these skills, plus others like ancient architecture and the conduct of war in biblical times, which he had acquired pragmatically during his various dates, he was now ready to apply to Tel Makor. But the location of his two trenches was so important that he intuitively postponed the decision. When the others left the Tel, he remained alone, walking aimlessly across the mound, kicking idly at the topsoil to determine its construction. A plateau, only 200 yards by 130 wide. Doesn't sound like much, he mused. Two ordinary football fields. But when you stand looking at it with a teaspoon in your hand and somebody says dig, the damn thing looks immense. He prayed to himself. So much depends on this. God, help me to pick the right spot. But his attention was diverted from this problem when he noticed protruding from the earth a small object which did not look like a pebble. Bending over to inspect it, he found a small piece of lead, slightly flattened on one side. It was a spent bullet, and he started to throw it away, but reconsidered. Voila! Our first find on Tel Makor, he said to himself. Spitting on his fingers, he cleaned the bullet until it lay dully heavy in his hand. Holding it between thumb and forefinger, he asked himself, level, age, provenience. Thus, using the bullet as an excuse for postponing his decision on the trenches, taking from his briefcase an excavation card, he sat on the edge of the mound and filled it in with that exquisite, almost feminine care he had always used in such work. The bullet had probably been fired from a British rifle, since they were the most common in these parts. Any recent date would be acceptable, but around 1950 AD was logical, since the bullet showed signs of aging, and he wrote that down. But he had no sooner done so than he erased the AD in some embarrassment and substituted CE. He was working in a Jewish country, which had formerly been a Muslim country, and here the use of Anno Domini was frowned upon. Yet the worldwide system of dating had to be respected, and that required a before Christ and an after Christ, whether Muslims and Jews liked it or not, just as all longitude was measured from an English observatory near London, whether Anglophobes liked that or not. So Colonnade wrote his date, 1950 CE, which had originally signified Christian era, but which was now universally read as Common Era. Dates before Jesus were written BCE, before the Common Era, and this satisfied everyone. With precise pen marks, he sketched the bullet and indicated its scale to 1, which meant that the drawing was 2 times as large as the original. Had the reverse been true, he would have labeled it 1 to 2. Reviewing his playful entry, his item 1 of the excavation He was pleased to find his pen still accurate, and added the neat JC. As Cullinane finished the final dot, he looked up to see that the most important member of his staff had arrived from Jerusalem and had climbed the tell to greet his colleagues. He was a tall, slender Jew, 2 years older than Cullinane, with deep-set eyes peering from beneath dark eyebrows. He had sunken cheeks, but full lips that were eager to smile. His dark hair came well down onto his forehead, and he moved with the grace of a man who had been both a soldier and a scholar. At present, he worked in one of the government ministries in Jerusalem and was pleased with the invitation that would keep him at Makor from mid-May through mid-October, for he was a trained archaeologist whose political skills had been found so valuable to the government that he was rarely allowed out in the field. His position at Makor was ambiguous. Ostensibly, he was to serve as chief administrator of the project, determining salaries, working hours, and living arrangements. If he were not efficient, the complex personalities involved in the dig could waste their time in petty squabbles, if not outright feuds. He was hired to be the dictator, but no one at Makor would recognize this fact, for Ilan Eliav was a master administrator, a man who rarely lost his temper. He was probably the best educated scholar in the expedition, speaking numerous languages, but his greatest asset was that he smoked a pipe, which he had a habit of rubbing in the palms of his hands until the complainant before him reached some kind of sensible decision without depending upon the intervention of Eliab. Workmen at previous digs had said, "I'm going in to see if the pipe will approve a raise." And the kindly Jew with the deep-set eyes would listen as if his heart were breaking, and the bowl of his pipe would revolve slowly in his palm until the workman realized for himself how preposterous a raise would be at that time. Actually, Dr. Eliav was the official watchdog of the dig. The tells of Israel were far too valuable to allow just anyone to come in with a team of amateurs to butcher them. The nation contained more than 100 unexcavated sites like Makor, and during the next 2 or 3 centuries, teams from universities in Peking and Tokyo, or from learned societies in Calcutta or Cairo, would accumulate the necessary funds to dig out these long-forgotten cities, and would be a disservice to humanity present and future if the sites were now abused. The problem was especially acute when archaeologists like Dr. Cullinane proposed to excavate by the trench method. For many crimes against history had been perpetrated in Israel by enthusiastic men with shovels who dug hasty trenches through improperly recorded levels. Normally, the Israeli government would have rejected a trench proposal like Cullinane's, but the Irish scholar had established such a good reputation, and it was known to be so well trained in archaeological matters that in his case permission was granted. Nevertheless, Dr. Eliav had been detached from his important desk job to be sure that the valuable tell was not mutilated. He now strode across the top of the mound, extended a long arm to a man he instinctively liked, and offered an apology. "I'm most sorry not to have been here when you arrived." "We're fortunate to have you on any terms," Cullinane said, for he knew why a scholar as important as Eliav had been released to work with him. If he had to accept a watchdog, he was pleased that it was to be Eliav. It was much easier to explain problems to a man who knew more than you did. "I tried to break away last week," Eliav explained. "I had 3 good days up here getting things organized, but they called me back. I want you to see the camp." He led Cullinane to the western edge of the plateau, where an ancient footpath led zigzag down the glacis toward an old rectangular stone building whose southern face was composed of 3 graceful Arab arches, forming an arcade which led to 4 cool white rooms. The largest would be Cullinane's office and the library, and the others would house photography, ceramics, and drafting. "This looks better than I expected," Cullinane said. "What was the building originally?" Eliav pointed with his pipe stem to Tabari, who volunteered. "Probably the home of some Arab olive grower, 200 or 300 years ago." Cullinane was impressed with the easy manner in which Tabari and Eliav worked together, showing none of the area's traditional antagonism between Arab and Jew. They had cooperated on several previous digs, and each respected the competence of the other. "Out here, on the sleeping tents, are the sleeping tents, 4 of them," Eliav continued, "and along this path lies Kibbutz Makor, where we'll take our meals." As he led the way to the communal agricultural settlement, Cullinane noticed the bronzed young men and women engaged in the work of the kibbutz. They were unusually attractive, and Cullinane thought, it took only a few years to change the hunched-up Jew of the ghetto into a lively farmer. Looking at the muscular young people, especially the free-moving women, he could not detect that they were Jews. There were blondes with blue eyes, and these looked like Swedes. There were blondes with square heads shorn flat, and these looked like Germans. There were redheads who looked like Americans, studious types who looked like Englishmen, and others who were sunburned to a near black and who looked like Arabs. An average man put amongst the lithe young people of Kibbutz Makor would have been able to isolate only about 10% who looked like his preconception of a Jew, and one of them would have been Jamil Tavari, the Arab. We've reached three major decisions about the kibbutz, Eliav explained as the group approached a large dining hall. We won't sleep here, we will eat here, and up till harvesting begins, we'll be allowed to employ the kibbutzniks on the dig. Is that good or bad? Colonel asked. Rest easy, Eliav said. We brought this tell to your attention only because the kibbutzniks kept pestering us with samples. See what we dug out of our tell? These kids love archaeology the way American kids love baseball. The archaeologists were seating themselves in the large mess hall when a lean, crew-cut young man of 35, wearing sandals, shorts, and T-shirt, approached to introduce himself as Schwartz, secretary of this kibbutz. Glad to have you eat with us. Colnane launched a formal and somewhat academic reply beginning, we want you to know how much we appreciate, but Schwartz cut him off. We appreciate your dollars, he said, leaving abruptly to signal a girl who was serving coffee. Genial fellow, Colnane mumbled as Schwartz deserted him. In him, you see the new Jew, Eliav half apologized. He's what makes Israel strong. Where's he from? He spoke like an American. No one knows, really. He's probably called Schwartz because he's dark. He survived God knows how, both Dachau and Auschwitz. He has no family, no history, only raw drive. Look at his arm when he comes back. A good-looking husky girl in tight shorts strode to the table, dealt out some cups and saucers, and began pouring coffee as if she were a laborer pouring cement. Slamming the pot down in case anyone wanted seconds, she went off to fetch some sugar. But Schwartz had anticipated her and slapped down a sugar bowl before Colnane. Americans want everything sweet, he said. But Colnane ignored the remark, for he was staring at Schwartz's left arm, where in blue indelible ink was tattooed a concentration camp number, S13741. Birthmark, Schwartz said. You speak like an American. After the war, I tried living in Boston, but I came here to join the fighting. Did you get your name in Boston? Colnane asked. Schwartz stopped. How'd you guess that? They were family I lived with. They were the family I lived with. Nice people, but they didn't know from nothing. I wanted to be where the war was. The husky girl now returned with a second bowl of sugar, started to slam it onto the table, saw that Schwartz had got there first, and retreated with the bowl to another table. As she left, Colnane said, It's refreshing to see a girl who doesn't wear lipstick. She does it for the defense of Israel, Schwartz said belligerently. How's that? No lipstick, no salon dancing. For the defense of Israel, Colnane repeated. Yes, Schwartz half snarled. Ask her yourself. Come here, Viva. The Saki girl sauntered back and said contemptuously, I am not one of those salonim. Salonim, Schwartz interpreted, those of the salon. I pledged with all my friends, never dance salon style. She looked insolently at Colnane and left with the awkward rhythm of a girl who excels in folk dancing, and Schwartz followed her. I hope Aviva's not on the pottery crew, Colnane said quietly. Wait a minute, Dr. Barel splashed. When I was 17, I took that same pledge. We felt then as Aviva feels now. Israel needed women who were ready to bear arms, to die at the battlefront if necessary. Lipstick and salon dancing were for the effete women of France and America. Primly, she put down her coffee cup and said, I'm glad the spirit still exists. But you wear lipstick now, Colnane pointed out. I'm older, Mrs. Barrell said, and now I fight for Israel on other battlegrounds. It was an odd statement, which Colnane preferred not to explore at the moment. I think we should get back for the meeting, he suggested. And the four scholars wound their way along the pleasant path toward the arched stone house, serving as their headquarters. But as Colnane reached the building, he happened to look south across the road and noticed, for the first time, the olive trees of Makor. They were incredibly old. Their existence was not measured in years or decades, but in centuries and millennia. Their trunks were gnarled, their branches broken. Many retained no centerwood at all, for the years had rotted away their cores, leaving only fragments standing. But these were sufficient to provide the twisted arms of the tree with life. And in the late spring, the olives were covered with those gray-green leaves that made the trees so attractive. Each wind that came down the ancient road rustled these leaves, turning the aspect of the grove from green to gray to some intermediate shimmering color. Colin had seen olives before, but never a grove like this. And as he was about to enter the building from which the dig would be directed, he felt himself pulled across the road to inspect one notable tree, a veritable patriarch whose gnarled trunk was merely a shell through which one could see in many directions. The tree bore only a few branches, and these were thick with maturing olives. And as the archaeologist stood inquiringly beside this stubborn relic, he was as close to the mystery of Makor as he would ever be. And in the presence of this august tree, John Colonnane felt humbled. It was a proper preparation for a dig, and he walked in silence to the room where his paid staff and their 19 helpers had assembled from various parts of the world in response to an advertisement he had run in various British and continental newspapers. An archaeological dig is proposed in Western Galilee for the summer campaign of 1964 and succeeding years. Qualified experts are welcomed if they can pay their own transportation to Israel. Food, lodging, medical care provided, but no salaries. More than 130 experienced men and women had applied, and from the list, he had selected the team who now sat before him. They were dedicated scholars, eager to work at their own expense if only they could help probe the secrets that lay buried in the tell, and each was prepared to use his mind and imagination as skillfully as he used his pick and hoe. On the back blackboard, Dr. Eliev had printed the exacting schedule that would govern the work for the next 5 months. 5 a.m. Reveille, 5:30 a.m. breakfast, 6 to 2 p.m. work at dig, 2 p.m. lunch, 3 to 4 p.m. siesta, 4 to 7 work in offices, 7:30 p.m. dinner, 8:30 to 10 p.m. consultations. Any questions? Eliev asked. In a high, petulant voice, the English photographer whispered, I don't find any break for afternoon tea. Those who knew how tough he could be laughed, and he was assured by Eliev that he at least would be provided for. I shall resume breathing, the English scholar said. Eliev then turned the board around to display 5 lines of data summarizing former digs to remind the archaeologists of the high standards facing them. The lines read campaigns 1902 to 08, archaeologist McAllister, site Gazer. Dimensions 880 by 175, available area 140,000. Campaigns 1926 to 32, Albright, Beit Mirsim 300 by 140, 40,000. 1929 to 34, Garod, Mount Carmel, Small Caves 1800. 52 to 58, Kenyon, Jericho 400 by 270,000. 55 to 57, Yadin, Hazor, 1,250 by 730, 900,000 available area. 1965 to 74, Us, Makor, 200 by 133, available area 20,000. Now Colonnade took a pointer and said, Gentlemen, and you very able ladies, I've asked Dr. Eliev to list these 5 earlier digs because we must remember them as we work. The dimensions are in yards. The last figure gives in square yards a rough estimate of the site actually available for digging. You'll notice that one of the greatest was very small in size, but the results Dorothy Garrod achieved in the Carmel Caves were incomparable. She seemed to be digging through deposits of pure gold. I think we could also remember profitably what Kathleen Kenyon accomplished at Jericho, because she didn't get to that tell till it had been worked over by many predecessors. It took Miss Kenyon to dig down and find the answers. 2 other digs are my favorites. Kiser was excavated by one man, McAllister, a church organist from Dublin, with the help of one man, Jamil Tavari's uncle. But the excavation and reporting done by these 2 men remain a masterpiece. We're 10 times as many, and we must accomplish 10 times as much. But our ideal shall be all right. We give his figures for the last campaign only. He found nothing spectacular at Beit Mirsim, but he taught archaeologists how to work scientifically. When we're done, I want it said they worked as honestly as Albright. He paused, then pointed to the last line. As you can see, we are a small town, so we can afford to go slowly. We'll sketch each item exactly as we find it and photograph it from several angles. Our plateau contains only 4 acres. But remember that in the days of King David, Jerusalem wasn't much larger. In point of fact, this year we shall attack no more than 2% of our total area. He asked for maps of the Tell to be distributed, and as the scholars studied the contour lines, Jamil Tabari started his briefing. All we know of Makor's history appears in 6 tantalizing passages. Ancient Hebrew sources mention it once. When the 12 tribes were receiving their appointments, it's listed as a town of no significance on the border between the portion of Asher along the sea and of Naphtali inland. It was never a major city like Hazor, nor a district capital like Megiddo. In the Amarna letters found in Egypt and dating back to about 1400 BCE, one reference: crawling on my belly, my head covered with ashes of shame, my eyes averted from your divine countenance. I humble myself 7 times 7 and report to the King of Heaven in the night. Makor was burned. A commentary on Flavius Josephus provides a cryptic passage. Jewish tradition claims that Josephus escaped by night from Makor. In a famous commentary on the Talmud, we find a series of delightful quotations from Rabbi Asher, the groats maker, describing day-to-day life in our countryside. In the next 700 years, silence, except for one brief sentence in the report of an Arab trader out of Damascus, and from the olives of Makor much profit. The groves we see on the other side of the road could be several thousand years old. In the Crusader period, however, we come to substantial written records, and I hope all of you will read Wenzel of Trier's Chronicle. You'll find 3 photographic copies in the library. Briefly, Wenzel tells us that Makor was captured by the Crusaders in 1099, and for about 200 years was the seat of the various Counts Volkmar of Gratz. We're convinced that at this level, we've got to find something of substance. After 1291, when Makor fell to the Mamelukes, the site vanishes from history. Not even traders mention it, and we must assume that human occupation ended there. But from the bedrock of the Tell, insofar as we can identify it, to the top is a distance of 71 feet, and we have a right to suppose that many good things lie buried in that vast accumulation. John will explain what we're going to do. Before he does, the English photographer interrupted. What's Makor mean? Sorry, Tabari said. Old Hebrew word, Makor, source. Any significance? The Englishman asked. We have always supposed it referred to a water supply, Tabari replied, but there's no record of where the water was. If any of you have bright ideas, we'd be pleased to hear them. Isn't it hidden under the towel? The photographer said. We've often wondered. Go ahead, John. Cullinane fastened a large-scale map of the tell to the blackboard and studied it. Where to begin? He asked. We shall dig 2 trenches, but where to locate them? He surveyed the map for several moments, then turned away to face his team. Each dig has its special problems, but we have one I have not encountered before. As you know, for some years I've been trying to gather the funds for this dig without luck, until one night at a dinner party I chanced to mention the fact that the tell I had in mind contained a crusader's castle. This man to my right repeated, a castle. When I nodded, he said, that would be a great thing to dig up, a castle. I carefully explained that when I said castle, I meant a ruined castle, but this captivated him even more. Can you imagine, he asked his wife, digging up a ruined castle? Before the week ended, he had put up the money. 3 times I explained to him that although he was interested in the castle, I was concerned with what lay below. I'm sure he didn't hear. So at Makor, we'd better find a castle, Tabari suggested. And if we do, I'm sure we can jolly the gentleman along regarding the real work that you and I wish to accomplish. Now, he returned to the map. Where do you find a castle? He allowed the question to sink in, then said slowly, my whole intuition warns me to start at least 1 trench in the northwest quadrant, but I'm deterred by 2 factors. The tell has a slight rise from west to east, from which I conclude that the Crusader fortress must have defied tradition and stood in the northeastern quadrant. Second, we haven't determined where the main gate to the tell stood, and both Eliav and Tabari believe it to have been at the southwest. I've argued that it must be dead south in the middle of this wall, but now I'm willing to concede that the others are right. If they are, we'd have to dig in the southwest for the gate and in the northwest for the castle, and that's putting all our eggs in the western basket. So late this afternoon, I made the final choices. Here in the southwest, our major trench, he drew a bold, straight line into the tell, and here in the northeast, a trench into the castle, and he marked a short north-south cut. The scientists relaxed. The decision had been made, and it was obvious what Cullinan was doing. He would dig quickly for the Crusader castle in order to find something that would satisfy the man putting up the money, but he would dig quietly at the presumed gate area, in hopes of finding those significant layers, those sherds of broken pottery, those stone fragments of wall and home that would reveal the greater history of the town. When the meeting ended and the others had gone, Tabari lingered, looking dissatisfied, and Cullinan thought, damn, he's one of those who listens, says nothing, then comes around to warn you that he can't prove your decision. But almost immediately, Cullinan dismissed the thought as unworthy. Jamil Tabari was not like that. If he was perplexed, it was for substantial reasons. What is it, Jamal? You're right in every detail, Tabari began. Except one? Correct. The Arab pointed to the big map. Trench A is where it should be. Trench B is bound to hit the castle. What I don't like, John, is you plan to dump the rubble in the wadi. He pointed to the deep gully to the north of the town and ran his long fingers lovingly back and forth across the area that Cullinan proposed to fill. Why not? Cullinan asked. It's a natural spot for the rubble. Correct, Tabari agreed. He pronounced the word correct, giving it a humorous twist. But for that very reason, it's also a natural spot in which other things might have happened. Burials, dumps, caves. John, we're gambling on some very big ideas here. We're not just excavating a Crusader castle to gratify. Correct, Cullinan interrupted, using Tabari's word against him. In my research, one thing perplexes me. Always has. Mind if we go out to the tell? He led Cullinan up the footpath until they reached the plateau, where, to their surprise, they saw the figure of Dr. Eliev kneeling on one knee at the eastern end, where Trench B was to run. And when he heard their approach, he slipped quietly down the eastern slope and disappeared. Wasn't that Eliev? Tabari asked. I doubt it, Cullinan replied, but he knew it was. Tabari led the way to the northern edge of the tell, from which they could look down the very steep flank into the bottom of the wadi. It was an ugly, sharp fall, broken by one area halfway down where level land had appeared for 100 yards, before the sheer fall continued to the bottom of the gully. The missing factor in all I've read, Tabari said, stems from the word makor itself, source, that from which another thing springs, the life factor. Why did generation after generation of people settle here? It could only have been because there was water, and plenty of it, but we've no idea where it was located. Where does the kibbutz get its water? Modern artesian wells. This provided no clue, so Cullinan asked, You think the original well may have been outside the town walls, like Megiddo? I don't know what I think, Tabari said cautiously, but I don't want you to fill up that wadi, because in a couple of years we may want to dig right down there. Your Uncle Mahmoud is famous in the reports because he followed hunches. You want me to follow this one? Correct, Tabari replied, and the dump was relocated. Next morning, Tabari distributed the small picks and hoes used by modern archaeologists. No shovel would be permitted at a respectable dig, and proceedings got off to a favorable start, principally because he followed another hunch. At Trench B, in the northeastern sector, he happened to see one of the kibbutzniks inspect an object and start to call a supervisor. On second thought, the young man hesitated as if he were going to place a small object in his pocket, keeping it for later sale. Did you want me? Tabari asked nonchalantly, walking up and holding out his hand. Yes, the kibbutznik said. I think I found something. And he handed Tabari a coin, which later occasioned much debate at the mess. It had obviously been issued by some Arabic-speaking nation, but what it was doing on Makor was not so easy to determine. Cullinan argued, it was found within a few inches of the top. It can't signify the presence of an Arab town nobody ever heard of. Yet it looks quite old. Can you decipher it, Jamil? Tabari had read some of the Arabic script and was trying to untangle the rest when the photographer appeared with 2 books from the library showing the coins of Palestine, and after much checking back and forth, proved that the coin had been issued sometime around the year 1000 CE. That's hard to accept, Cullinan protested. That's 100 years before the Crusaders. And if what you say is right, he hesitated, and used the classic complaint of the archaeologist. That coin has no right to be there. Later, he told Tabari everything would have been a lot simpler if he'd let that kibbutznik keep his damn coin and maybe sell it to some tourist in Akko. Warn your men not to dig up any facts that confuse the issue. But 4 days later, the men at Trench B found something that was indeed bizarre. And when Colnane finished his card, he joked, Tabari, someone's salting our dig. This was a constant danger at an archaeological site. Enthusiastic workmen seeking to gain bonuses and also to please the foreigners whom in general they liked were accustomed to hide things in the soil and then to come upon them triumphantly with their hoes. But cursory inspection of the new find satisfied even Colnane, and no workman could have procured this particular item for salting. It was made of gold. With the menorah, because it was so exclusively Jewish, occasioned much excitement both at the dig and at the kibbutz. But it was impossible to date, for the seven-branched candelabrum had been used by Jews at least since the days of Exodus, when God handed down detailed instructions as to how they should be made. And 6 branches shall come out of the sides of it, 3 branches of the candlestick out of one side, and 3 branches of the candlestick out of the other side. The Lord had gone on and on, for apparently the menorah was an object of personal importance to him. It's a work of art, Colnane admitted grudgingly, but of no archaeological value. He pushed it away, unaware that it was to become the most notorious single object that would be found at the dig. Damn, he growled. A bullet, a gold coin, nearly 1,000 years too old, and a menorah. All this, all in the wrong levels at the wrong times. What kind of dig is this? 3 mornings later, an event occurred which, at the time, he did not consider important. A journalist from Australia, a likable, breezy fellow, stopped by the dig and, after asking many irrelevant questions, happened to see the gold menorah. What's that? He asked. It's called a menorah, Colnane explained somewhat impatiently. This means you're going to find a lot of gold. It's much too recent to be of any archaeological value. I understand, but even so, could I have a photograph of it? I think we'd better not. By the way, what is it? A 7-branched candlestick, Colnane explained. And some days later, when time came to review what had gone wrong, he was able to recall 2 things that had happened at this point. The Australian had carefully counted each of the arms. 5, 6, 7, while a look of almost boyish pleasure came into his frank and appealing face. Dr. Colnane, if I were careful to explain that this menorah, as you call it, had no historical significance, couldn't I please have just one photograph? And against his reasoned judgment, Colnane gave permission. Quickly, the Australian whipped out a Japanese camera and called for one of the older kibbutzniks to pose holding the candelabrum. Look at it, he ordered the man, and after a few whirlwind operations, he thanked Colnane and hurried back to the airport at Tel Aviv. I wish I had such energy. Colnane laughed, but he was diverted from further comment by a Tabari, who came running from Trench B with a coin that had been dislodged from a crevice among some buried stones. It was so large that it must originally have been of considerable value. But when he cleaned it, it turned out to be not a coin at all, but a bronze seal. It was a striking find, an authentic Crusader piece, and while it did not prove that Trench B was going to intercept the castle, it did prove that at least one of the Volkmars had been on that tower. I think we're close to the castle, Tabari said with great enthusiasm, or quiet enthusiasm. And Colnane sent Paul J. Zodman, his Chicago millionaire, a cable stating that positive identification of the ruins seemed near at hand. Before Zodman could reply, a copy of a London paper reached McCore with news that shook the dig, and was followed by papers from Rome, Paris, and New York, repeating a lurid story about goings-on at the McCore dig. For the Australian had released with photographs an exciting yarn under the title The Candlestick of Death, relating how in Bible times an evil king had identified his 7 principal enemies, and how he had lighted 7 candles, instructing his general, by the time the 7th candle burns out, my 7 enemies are to be dead. The first candle guttered down, and the enemy was beheaded. The 6th flickered away, and the 6th enemy was gone. But as the 7th candle trembled in the central cup, the general turned unexpectedly and lopped off the head of the king, for he was his own worst enemy. And then the general buried the hateful 7-branched candelabrum beneath the wall where Dr. John Colnane has so brilliantly found it, for it was a thing accursed. The main photograph showed a distinguished-looking elderly scholar recoiling from the menorah in horror. The caption read, Dr. Georg Moskowitz, renowned archaeologist, says this evil piece may well doom all who possess it, for it bears the curse of death. Conan groaned and did something he rarely did. He swore. Who in the hell is Dr. Georg Moskowitz? Tvar said, he's that nice old Romanian who sweeps up. Get him in here, Conan snapped. But when the kibbutznik appeared, soft-spoken and apprehensive, Tavares took over. This you in the picture? Dr. Conan was standing there when the man took it. Dr. Conan studied the picture and said, I don't remember you looking that way. Just before the man took the picture, he made a face at me, the Romanian explained. I jumped back. But surely you didn't say anything about a curse of death. No, but as the man was going to his car, he called me over and asked if I thought a candlestick could carry a curse, and to get rid of him, I said maybe. That afternoon, the first excursionists stopped at the hotel, asking to see the candlestick of death, and the next morning a tour bus arrived. Conan was distressed and sought out Eliav, to whom he said, I've worked hard to protect the good name of this dig. 6 of the applicants who volunteered to help us were publicity hounds, and I kept them off, like Stickler of Geneva. We saw your sensible interview when the Chicago Reporter wanted to say that you were expecting to dig up new revelations about the Bible. Eliav lit his pipe. And yet we are digging among the foundations of 3 great religions. We've got to keep it clean. Do you expect to find materials relating to Christianity? Eliav asked. Materials? You mean manuscripts, proofs? No, but insights? Yes. The 2 men fell silent, and after a while Conan asked, as a Jew, don't you hope to find something that will illuminate? Why do you suppose I work on these digs? Eliav asked. Each time I sink a pick into the earth, I hope, in a vague sort of way, to turn up something that will tell me more about Judaism. He hesitated. No, that's wrong. Not tell me. Tell the world, because the world needs to know. The responsibility of the task on which the 2 men were engaged caused them to look with disgust on the newspaper stories. For although neither expected to uncover specific new materials relating to Judaism or Christianity or Islam, each hoped that Makor might provide some serious information which would advance understanding of the societies in which these religions arose. From now on, we keep newspapermen and tourists out of here, Conan concluded. But even as he spoke, Tabari appeared with a cable from Chicago. Conan, stop. Regardless of what other fines the Israeli government may demand for itself, it is imperative that you secure Candlestick of Death for Chicago, Paul J. Zodman. Conan shook his head and gave Tabari the job of reassuring Zodman that it would be arranged. Chicago would get the treasure. On the next day, such trivia were forgotten. For Eliav reported that workmen in Trench B had uncovered positive proof that they were digging in Crusader ruins. An inscription which can be dated 1105 CE. John, it looks as if we've hit the castle. As word of the discovery sped through the kibbutz, a strange thing happened. Clerks counting eggs, cooks at work in the kitchen, boys in school, and the volunteers from the various countries stopped what they were doing and hurried silently to the tell, where they stood in expectant groups, watching as the archaeologists tapped gingerly at pebbles while girls with brushes cleared away the debris. From thousands of miles away, men had come to probe into the secrets of the tell, and at this hour they had struck a significant thing. It was a magnificent moment. But so many spectators crowded the edges of Trench B that Tabari had to move them back, lest the sides collapse. And as the crowds withdrew, 10 of the stronger workmen jumped down to haul away the last of the rubble. But the rock bearing the inscription they did not touch, for it would first have to be photographed in situ, and then sketched by the camp draftsman in the precise position in which it was found, because from such photographs and drawings, some imaginative theorist, who had never seen Makor, might construct an explanation which would illuminate a whole period of history. When the pictures were taken, Tabari called his workmen out of the trench, and spectators were allowed to file in and see for themselves the first major find at Makor. Conan waited his turn, and when he saw the beautiful old stone, carved so carefully by some medieval guildsman, he experienced a rush of joy. The castle existed. The first stage of the dig was a success, and in succeeding years, the beautiful ruins could be leisurely explored. In the meantime, he filled out the provisional card. When Tabar saw the date, he objected, pointing out that in this instance, The stone could be ascribed with finality to the year 1105 CE because there was documentary evidence in the Wenzel of Trier's Chronicle that Count Volkmar of Gretz had died that year. But Cullinan observed dryly, "We know when he died, but we don't know when the stone was carved and let into the wall, more likely around the date I suggest." An unfortunate atmosphere now developed at the dig, the kind of thing an experienced administrator tries to forestall. Nothing of even minor importance had been uncovered at A, so that the team working at that site began to lose spirit, while the gang at B greeted each morning eagerly, wondering what evidence they would lay bare that day. Perhaps crusader dining plates decorated with fish, pieces of chain armor, carved fragments from a chapel, dozens of stones which could impart a very real sense of a castle in which knights had lived and from which they had gone out to fight. During one period of 3 weeks in June, the diggers found stones that were heavily charred, even cracked apart by some forgotten heat, and they speculated on what accident could have built up a blaze so great as to scar a whole section of castle. Digging at Trench B in those days was an exciting experience, and if one wanted a good example of the manner in which archaeology could uncover lost secrets, it was there. At the same time, Trench A showed how a dig could go wrong, for it had obviously missed the main gate. After weeks of disappointing excavation, Colony assembled his crew at the barren trench and asked, "What's to do?" Eliav now admitted that the gate must stand well to the east, where Conan had suggested in the first place, and he advised abandoning the disappointing trench and transferring operations 70 yards eastward. But Conan said no. At Trench B, we've found the castle, and if the rest of the tell is unproductive, we need to know that too. To the disappointment of the Trench A kibbutzniks, he ordered them to go ahead as planned, trying to convince them that what you're doing here is just as important as what they're doing over there. He found this a difficult thesis to defend. So the gang at Trench A plodded through the unrewarding rubble until, by brute strength, they had thrown out enough soil to lay bare the 3 concentric walls that had guarded Makor. Sometime around 3500 BCE, men not yet identified had built the thick outer wall by throwing together huge stones in haphazard piles. 2,000 years later, well before the age of Saul and Solomon, some other unidentified groups had built the sturdy middle wall, and 2,500 years after that, at the time of the Crusaders, the inner wall had been erected, and it was a European masterpiece. How it had been penetrated, what part of the castle fire had played in its destruction, Cullinan, as a scientist, refused to guess. He supposed that after the completion of this final wall, the sloping flanks had been repaved with rock, the most recent construction on the tell, a mere 800 years old. Attacking Makor could never have been a simple undertaking. Cullinan, visualizing the plateau crouched within the triple walls, they did not stand, of course, in 3 separated rings. All were crumbled, and each grew out of its predecessor. But each also existed in its own unique construction, told the others. All we're looking for occurred within this little stone cocoon. We've laid bare the pattern, but not the significance. And then, in quick succession, some distance inside the inner wall, the diggers at Trench A came up with 3 finds, none so spectacular as the remnants of the castle, but all of a nature that sent the history of Makor rocketing backwards, so that after these items were appraised by the scholars, the balance between the trenches was restored, and the hidden secrets of the mound began to unfold in an orderly pattern. The first find was merely a piece of limestone intricately carved in a manner no Jew or Christian would adopt. It was obviously of Muslim origin, a poetic decoration for a mosque, but on its face, some later Christian hand had imposed a panel with 5 crosses. The experts now focused on Trench A, where a picture of chronological confusion developed, indicated by interrupted building lines and broken foundations. The Muslim stone proved that either a mosque or part of a building used as a mosque had once stood in this area, but that later Christians had converted it into a church. However, as the diggers probed deeper, it became clear that the significant building had been a great Byzantine basilica with a mosaic floor, and Cullinan dug with increasing excitement, hoping to uncover some kind of substantial proof that Makor had owned one of the early Christian churches of the Galilee. But it was Tabari who finally brushed away a pile of dust to reveal a handsome stone on which had been carved a set of 3 crosses in bas relief. When he climbed out of the trench, Eliab went down with the photographer for a series of shots of the stone in situ, for it was essential to record where it had stood and how it had fitted into the wall, especially since the stone was lodged in a section which seemed to have been built and rebuilt several times. Whether it had formed part of the mosque could not now be determined. Only later excavation would establish the relationships. But as Eliab brushed away some earth so that the camera could catch a shadow showing how the rock abutted onto those above and below, some irregularity on the upper surface of the stone caught his practiced eye, and he asked for a small pick and a brush. With these implements he dislodged the dust, 1,600 years old, that had sifted in between stones, and he satisfied himself that he had come up with something of great moment. Without speaking, he made way for the photographer and walked slowly over to where Cullinan was showing his sketch to Vered, Bar-El, and Tabari. Taking the card, Eliab said quietly, "I'm afraid you've some more work to do on this one, John." "What do you mean?" Eliab looked soberly at his colleagues. "The kind of thing we dream about," he said. The other three experts lined up behind him as he led the way back to the trench. No one spoke, but at the newly found stone, Cullinan asked the photographer to retire, then fell on his hands and knees and peer into the dusty space a quarter of an inch high. When he rose, his eyes were alight, and Dr. Bar-El and Tabari, when they saw what Eliab had partially uncovered, reacted in the same way. "I want the draftsman down here right away," Cullinan called. There were only a few hours of good light left, and he directed her to sketch from all angles the Christian rock with its stalwart crosses. At the same time, the photographer was directed to shoot the rock lavishly, after which they would pull out the stone to inspect the hidden face. But in spite of the urgency that communicated itself throughout the dig, it became apparent that the remaining hours of the day would have to be spent in drawing. Any further work on the rock must wait till next morning. "We could do it under lights," Tabari suggested, but this Eliab quickly vetoed, and as darkness fell, a sense of deep excitement settled over McCoy. At dinner, the older kibbutzniks were as pleased as the youngsters who worked at the dig, partly because every family in Israel had at least one amateur archaeologist. Rare was the house that had no flints, no pottery, no echoes of the past, and partly because everyone in the kibbutz thought of the work as his dig. "I hear we hit something big today," one of the serving men said to Cullinan. The Irishman's eyes were too bright for him to deny his excitement. "We found the cornerstone of a Christian church," Cullinan replied. "Great day for the Irish." "But that running around at the end," the man asked, "what was it about?" He propped his tray on the table, leaning on it as if he were the owner of a restaurant. "We don't know," Cullinan said. "Can't you guess?" the kibbutznik demanded. "We'll guess tomorrow," Cullinan replied. He was becoming irritated with his man. But the young fellow said, "Could we come up and watch?" And Cullinan became aware that 8 or 9 of the kitchen staff had crowded about his chair, eager to know what was happening on their tell. "All right," Cullinan said. "Be there at 6. And as day started, more than 100 persons lined the trench, watching silently as the 4 senior archaeologists descended to work on the Christian stone. "You have enough photographs?" Cullinan asked the English cameraman. "Developed them last night, all okay." "You have enough sketches?" The young woman nodded, so Tabari began working cautiously along the edges of the rock, but it could not be moved. "We'll have to take out those layers on top," Eliab suggested, and to do this required the better part of an hour. None of the watchers left. The important stone now stood with only one large rock bearing down upon it, and Conan called the photographer in for a final series of shots, after which he and Eliab began to lift the obstructing stone with crowbars. Slowly they raised the ancient burden until Tabari, peering into the dusty darkness, could see the surface about to be exposed. "It's there," he shouted. And Dr. Bar-El, looking over his shoulder, whispered, "My God, it's perfect." They took away the cover stone, then brushed the dust from the long hidden surface to display the carving of a little flat wagon with funny flat-sided wheels bearing a house with a curved roof guarded by palm trees. The archaeologists stood back so that the kibbutzniks could see the treasure, but no one spoke. Finally, Eliav said, "It's a great day for the Jews." for this was a folklore representation of the flat wagon bearing the wooden Ark of the Covenant, in which the tablets of the Ten Commandments were supposed to have been carried from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land. Originally, this stone must have enjoyed a place of honor in the synagogue of Makor, but when the structure was torn down by the victorious Christians, some workmen had carved his three crosses on a different face, while the vanquished Jewish side was cemented into the darkness of the basilica. To have the Jewish symbols exposed now, before Jews who had returned from exile to build their kibbutz near the ancient site, constituted a luminous moment, and Dr. Kolnane, happening to look up from the trench, saw that some of the older kibbutzniks had tears in their eyes. With deep pleasure, he modified his earlier drawings and filed it. Almost before he was finished, a workman found a coin that completed the violent sequence of that period: Roman temple, synagogue, basilica, mosque, church, all equally collapsed into a shared destruction. Konin allowed the stone and the coin to be exhibited at the kibbutz for some days, and grave-faced Jews stood before them, looking first at their long-buried ark, but staring mostly at the hard face of Vespasian, whose armies had destroyed their temple, and at the figure of Judea Capta as she mourned in humiliation under the palm tree. It was one of the most beautiful coins ever issued, this flawless union of imperial force and tribute sorrow, and it fascinated the modern Jews whose history it summarized. Kolnane, himself deeply affected by the three emotionally related finds, cabled Paul Zodman, "Things happening very fast. Stop. Better come over." The relationship between the two trenches was now reversed, as often occurred at a dig. Trench B wallowed about in the foundations of the Crusader fort, whose walls cut deep through many levels of occupation, obliterating them all and rendering them largely useless for contemporary study. The diggers in this trench now seemed mainly occupied with shifting heavy stones. But in Trench A, which transected the multiple religious structures, intellectual and archaeological activity was keen, and the reason for bringing along an architect from the University of Pennsylvania became clear. At the top of the trench was only 30 feet wide. At the top, the trench was only 30 feet wide and had sloping sides, so the amount of wall exposed was never great. But by pecking away at the earth and guessing at what had stood on what, the architect could sometimes come up with clever deductions as to how the various jigsaw pieces had fitted together. He was a patient man who allowed the sweating kibbutzniks to stalk past him as if he did not count. But when they were through lifting and tugging, he was there on his knees, often with a whisk broom, trying to catch signs of how the stones had been dressed and whether they bore fragments of earlier cement, indicating a prior use in some other wall. The quality of this man's imagination would determine what course the excavations would follow in future years, and the amount of information he could deduce from what to another man would be merely one line of rocks crossing another line was surprising. Not one of the four top archaeologists at Makor could approach his proficiency in this specialized field. Only one thing interfered with his work, and he complained about this to Colnane. "Really, John, you've got to tell those girls to wear more clothes. I find them a very disturbing element." "I've wondered about this myself," Colnane said. The dig at Makor was witnessing a phenomenon of the age, common to all countries. For protection from the near-tropic sun, young men wore hats, long-sleeved shirts, shoes, and socks to protect their ankles, while girls got along with little, sleeveless blouses, shorts, no stockings, and tennis shoes. After a few days of sunburn, the kibbutz girls became bronzed goddesses, rounded and beautiful. They were modest and well-behaved, but they were also alluring, and there could have been few men working at the dig who were not at one time or another tempted to reach out and pinch these lovely Jewish maidens. Of course, such temptation was one of the unexpected pleasures of archaeology in Israel, but Colonnane agreed with his architect. It was a lot easier digging in Egypt. There, the women had to wear clothes. But when the architect protested a second time, "John, I was truly worried. If she had lifted that rock, she would have popped out all over." He decided that something must be done. He therefore summoned Dr. Bar-El and said in his best administrative manner, "Mrs. Bar-El, I think you'd better speak to the girls. They really must wear more clothes." "What do you mean?" she asked innocently. "The men, they've begun to complain." "You mean the shorts?" She began to laugh at his embarrassment. "Really, John, no sensible man's complaining about shorts, I hope." "Not exactly," he stammered. "Aren't the girls doing a good job?" she asked offensively. Yes, in fact, they're superior to any others I've worked with, but won't you please speak to them? I wonder if I'm the proper one to do it, she said shyly. Well, you're a woman, but you haven't seen the shorts I propose to wear, she said quietly. He was left alone, fumbling with a pencil. That afternoon she wore them, and although her outfit was not immodest, it was tantalizingly arranged, and when Cullinan first saw her heading for a trench he stopped what he was doing to watch. Then he smiled as he saw the architect follow her approvingly down the trench, and he made no further effort to discipline the kibbutz girls. They were, as he had told Dr. Barrell, the most energetic and intelligent workers he had ever employed, and if they wished to provide a daily beauty parade, that would have to be one of the extra features at Makor. But when Vered Barrell went past, holding a piece of broken pottery, he asked himself, what would McAllister and Albright think if they could see a dig like this? She was a delightful person, Vered Barrell, 33 years old, a widow from the War of Independence, and a fine scholar who had been offered university posts in several countries. That she had not remarried since 1956, when her young husband was killed during the Sinai campaign, surprised Dr. Colney. He asked her about it once as they were going across the Tell, and she had said frankly, I have been married to Israel, and one of these days I must get a divorce. He had asked her what she meant by the first part of the sentence, and she explained, an outsider cannot imagine how hard we fought to gain a state here. They absorbed all our energies. As Efat, for example, the town in the hills. She stopped, and it was obvious that she felt herself assailed by memories too difficult to discuss. You ask Elief someday, she said, and she had run down off the Tell. As for the second part of her sentence, Colonian understood this only too well. As the son of an impoverished Irish day laborer on the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, he had devoted himself so single-mindedly to an education, acquiring a polished accent and a PhD at the same time, that he had not married, and his devout mother had fairly well given up parading before him the daughters of her Irish friends. Yet he knew that for a man to be 40 without a wife was patently absurd, and open to suspicion as well. And since the fortunate offer by Paul Zodman to finance the McCord had settled his economic and professional problems for the next decade, there was no reasonable excuse for delaying marriage any longer. But like the meticulous man he was, the man who signed each card so precisely JC, he was studying the problem with scientific detachment. He had, one might say, excavated his way through levels 1 to 13 of Chicago's Irish society, and he had come upon some interesting pieces. But he had so far found nothing in the human field to compare with the Christian-Jewish cornerstone that he had found at Makor's level 7. Then there was Mrs. Barrell, working beside him each day, wearing her shorts and smiling at him with her flashing eyes and white teeth. She was an easy girl to remember when one was at the other side of the Tell or sleeping in the next tent. He responded to her in two interesting ways which had little to do with her personality. When considering marriage, he remembered how men his age often made asses of themselves, and he had sworn never to become involved with any girl more than 12 years his junior. Vered was only 7 years younger. Also, he had an affinity for girls who were shorter than he was, and Vered was positively petite. That she was also an archaeologist neither added to nor detracted from her general appeal. And as for the fact that she was Jewish and he Catholic, he dismissed this as a problem of little consequence. In fact, he chuckled as he recalled the joke that had been popular during his Navy service in the Korean War. A soldier calls his Irish mother in Boston and says, Mom, this Xavier in Korea, she wanted to warn you that I've married a Korean girl. To his surprise, his mother makes no objection. In fact, she seems pleased. Bring the girl home, Zave. You can stay with us. But where can we stay in your house, Mom? It's so small. You can use my room, Zave, because the minute that Korean bitch puts her foot through the door, I'm going to cut my throat. It seemed to John Colnane that more than half of his friends were married to what their parents thought were the wrong mates. Catholics with Baptists, Jews with Armenians, and Xavier with his Korean wife, and he gave the problem no more thought. His present liberal views in these matters marked a sharp change from his youth in Gary, Indiana, where he had grown up in a Catholic neighborhood, whose popular sport had been the seeking out of Jewish schoolchildren during their tedious afternoons. He and his friends would lurk behind fences, rock and fist, waiting for the occasional Jew in the district to come furtively home. With yells, they would spring upon him, pummeling him harshly and shouting, Jew boy, gonna crucify a goy. Once the truant officer had come to the Colonnade home with a warning. Mike, your boy has got to quit picking on the Ginsburg kids. A fine thing, his father had stormed. An officer of the law, wasting his time over such a matter. Mike, it's got to stop. The Jews is making protests to the mayor. Over what? They crucified Jesus, didn't they? Why did we do it? Colonnade sometimes asked himself. in later years, and he found no difficulty in determining the answer. As each Easter season approached, the priest in his parish launched a series of sermons recounting the crucifixion of our Savior, and his Irish brogue would hang almost longingly upon the terrible mystery of our Lord's passion. Young Cullinane and his friends would listen in growing anger as they heard of the manner in which the Jews betrayed Jesus, forced a crown of thorns upon his brow, nailed him to the cross, pierced his side, mocked him in his agony, and even bargained in selling his clothes. It was almost more than the boys could bear, and it infuriated them to think that descendants of those same Jews were roaming the streets of Gary that day. It was not till Cullinane reached college that he discovered that it had not been the Jews who had done these things to Jesus, it had been Roman soldiers. He also discovered that no Catholic dignitary who had advanced beyond the stage of parish priest any longer proclaimed such views, but by then it did not matter. On his own recognizance, he had discovered that an instinctive hatred of the Jew made no sense, and that a rational dislike could be supported by no evidence whatever, and he had changed so completely that now he could even contemplate marrying a Jew. He found himself thinking about Verret a good deal, and one of the thoughts that recurred most often was a warning delivered years earlier by a French archaeologist in Egypt. Many digs in the Near East have come to grief because God made little girl archaeologists and little boy archaeologists, and when you put them together in tents at the edge of a desert, the strangest things can happen. Now, this is particularly true of digs organized by Englishmen, because somehow the English woman, so proper at home, seems to go to pieces as soon as she sees a pickaxe plopped in the earth. In a nice way, that is. In furtherance of this theory, the English photographer was romancing with the kibbutz girls, and Cullinane didn't blame him a bit. In spite of the strenuous schedule laid out by Eliav, there was a good deal of social life at the kibbutz, and in the long summer evenings, the group used to gather for folk dancing. Word had gone out that the big boss was a bachelor, and some very pretty girls hauled him onto the floor while the accordion beat out folk music and partners swept through beautiful old dances, some from Russia, others from the steep hills of Yemen. Cullinane found the kibbutz girls too young for serious attention, but he did confess to one change of opinion, which he shared with Tabari. In America, I always thought that folk dancing was for girls too ugly and too fat for modern dancing. I stand corrected. In July, he became uncomfortably aware of the fact that at the kibbutz dances, Bar El usually preferred to dance with Dr. Eliav, and they made an attractive pair. His lank frame moved with masculine charm through the peasant steps, while her petite body had a lively grace, especially in those dances where girls were required to pirouette, their petticoats flying out parallel to the floor. Tabari also arranged evening excursions to historic sites like Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, or the poetic ruins of Caesarea, King Herod's ancient capital, where Cullinane saw Verret standing in the moonlight beside a marble column that had once graced the king's gardens, and she seemed to be the spirit of Israel, a dark-haired, lovely Jewess from Bible times, and he had wanted to run to her and tell her so. But before he did, Dr. Eliav moved beside her. He had been standing behind the pillar, holding her hand, and Cullinane felt like an ass. And then one night in mid-July, as he inspected the dig in moonlight, he was alerted by someone moving along the northern edge of the plateau, and he suspected it might be a worker out to steal a Crusader relic. But it was Vered Barel, and he ran to her with a kind of release and caught her in his arms, kissing her with a vigor that astonished both of them. Slowly she pushed him away, holding onto the lapels of his field jacket and looking up at him with her dark, saucy eyes. "John," she said. She laughed warmly. "Don't you know I'm engaged to Dr. Eliav?" "You are." He brushed her hands away as if he were afraid of them. "Of course, that's why I came on this dig, rather than Masada." He'd wondered about that in Chicago. Why would Bar El pass up a sure thing like Masada to work with me? He became angry. Damn it all, Vered. If he's engaged to you, why doesn't he do something about it? For just a moment, she looked as if she had been asking herself the same question, but quickly recovered and said lightly, "Sometimes these things." He kissed her again and said most seriously, "Vered, if he's held back this long, why not marry a man who means business?" She hesitated, as if inviting him to kiss her again, then pushed him away. "You mean too much business," she said softly. "How long have you been engaged?" Standing apart from him, she said, "We were in the war together. I roomed with his wife before she was killed. He fought beside my husband." These are things that bind people. You make it sound like patriotic incest. She slapped his face with all her force and all her anger. These are serious matters. Never, never. She threw herself into his arms and sobbed. After a while, she whispered, "You're a man I could love, John, but I fought desperately for this Jewish land, and I'd never marry anyone but a Jew." He dropped his arms. Her statement was archaic and somehow offensive. It was inappropriate for this moment when two people were groping for love. If the Jews of Europe had gone through what they did in order to build a state in which an attractive widow of 33 could talk like that, you're no farther along than the Irish Catholics I used to know in Gary, Indiana. You bring a Polak husband into this house, and I'll horsewhip the both of you. That was my father speaking to my sister. I didn't ask you to kiss me, Verd pointed out. I'm sorry I did, Colleen snapped. She took his angry hands and held them to her cheeks. That's an unworthy remark, and you know it. I've watched you working in the trenches, John. You want to know every fact there is, and no prejudice diverts you. All right, you've been digging in this trench, and you've uncovered something you don't like. A Jewish girl who has seen so much terror that there's only one thing in the world she wants to be, a Jewish girl. The force of her words made Colleen respect what she said, but he could not rationally accept it. If he understood anything about human relations, he knew that Vered Bar-El was not going to marry Dr. Eliot. She gave no impression of being in love with him, and he no sense of being hungry for her. Like the Israel of which she was a part, she was caught in historical cross-currents rather than in the motion of love, and she betrayed her awareness of this unsatisfactory situation. With compassion, Colleen observed her uncertainty, then said, Vered, I've spent the last 20 years looking for a wife. I wanted someone who was intelligent, not afraid of big ideas, and, well, feminine. Such girls aren't easy to find, and I won't let you go. You'll never marry Aliev. Of that I'm convinced. But you will marry me. Let's go back, she said. And when they entered the main room of the Arab house, the others began to giggle. Then Colleen gained reassurance for his theory when Dr. Eliev said lightly, not as an outraged lover, but as a boy in college might have spoken to his roommate. Looks to me, Colleen, as if you've been kissing my fiancée. The Irishman wiped his lips, looked at his fingertips, and said, I thought Israeli girls had forsworn selenium and lipstick. They sometimes do, Eliev said, but later they reconsider. Colleen decided to play along with the make-believe and extended his hand. In later years, Eliev, your wife can truthfully taunt you. If I hadn't married you, I could have gone to Chicago with a real man. I'm sure I'll hear about it, the tall Jew said, and the two archaeologists shook hands. If it's a formal engagement, the English photographer cried, we'll celebrate all night. And somebody jumped into a jeep to dash into Akko for some bottles of arak. But for John Colleen, the songs and dances were tedious. For watching Vered and her man, he knew that this was a spurious engagement party. More important, he had admitted to her and to himself how much he needed her, and he wondered what the relationship could be during the remainder of the day. Next morning, as Colleen was sketching the first object so far uncovered, which might date from before the Christian era, Dr. Eliev received a phone call from the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem advising him that Paul J. Zodman of Chicago was arriving at the airport that afternoon and was to be extended every courtesy, becoming a man who had contributed generously to the establishment of Israel. A few minutes later, a cablegram reached Colleen, advising him of Zodman's arrival, and a few minutes after that, the Tel Aviv agent of the United Jewish Appeal called to say, Is this the Zodman dig? I want the director. Zodman's arriving this afternoon, and for God's sake, keep him happy. Colleen finished his sketch and called into the other room. Now we can all begin to sweat. 2 cars drove down from Makor, Tabari and Eliev in one, Mrs. Bar-El and Colleen in the other. It was Eliev who had insisted upon this arrangement, sensing that the potential unpleasantness of the night before must be thoroughly dispersed if the dig was to function properly. Furthermore, he added, I've found that it never hurts when you're meeting a millionaire to have a good-looking girl around. It makes him feel the operation is first class. This girl is not good-looking, Colleen said. She's beautiful. Vered kissed him lightly before the others, and any tension that might have persisted was relaxed. On the long trip to the airport, Vered said, We've heard a lot about Paul Zodman. What kind of man is he? Colleen reflected. He's 3 times more intelligent than you're about than you're going to think, and 3 times more stupid. Has he ever been to Israel? No. I read about his gifts. 50,000 for planting trees, 500,000 for the School of Business Administration. How much for the dig? Third of a million? He's not altogether ungenerous, as the British might say. Why has he done it, if he's never been here? He's typical of many American Jews. One day he said, in Germany I'd be dead. In America I own 7 stores. If I didn't give to Israel, I'd be a jerk. Strictly charity? Barrett asked. He has no particular sense of partnership with us? Colnane laughed. When he sees how successful this country is, roads, hospitals, he's going to feel let down. He thinks he's been feeding outcasts in a ghetto. What does he look like? What do you think? How old is he? That I'll tell you. He's 44. Married? Yes. You get his money from his father? 4 of his stores he inherited. The rest he's done himself. I see him as a big man, Barrett said. Aggressive. Never read a book but respects college professors like you. He must be liberal. He wouldn't have hired a Catholic for your job. Did you mention it when you said you'd never marry a non-Jew? Oh, did you mean it when you said you'd never marry a non-Jew? Colleen asked abruptly. I certainly did. Our family has a story which sums it all up. When we moved from Russia to Germany, my aunt wanted to marry an Aryan, whatever that means. In her case, it meant a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Prussian with a good university education. Our family raised hell, but it was grandmother who delivered the telling blow. She said, for any man, being married is difficult, and no man should be tempted later in life to get rid of his wife merely because she's a Jewess. He'll have enough other reasons. My father said that. Everyone laughed at the old woman's reasoning, and my aunt wept. Why would Otto be tempted to get rid of me because I'm a Jewess? And the old woman explained, the day may come when Germany will make its men give up their Jewish wives. And my aunt cried a good deal, but she didn't marry Otto. He married another Jewish girl, and in 1938, he was forced to get rid of her, and the poor girl was sent to an extermination camp. Of course, my aunt went to the same camp, but she went with her husband. You think the time could come in America when I would be commanded to get rid of you because you're Jewish? I don't bother with specific cases, Red replied. I only know that the wise old grandmothers were right. When the jet landed, there could be no mistake as to who Paul Zodman was. The first passengers to alight were ordinary French and American businessmen, bearing no marks of distinction. The next were some elderly men weighed down with cameras, and one could not think of Zodman as bothering to collect visual records of where he had been, for he was mostly concerned with where he would go next. 2 powerfully built men descended, but they lacked any intellectual quality, and they were followed by 3 or 4 who might have been Zodman, except they were sloppily dressed and careless in manner. Then came a man about 5'8", underweight, dressed in a dark blue English suit, conservatively tailored, sunburned, but not from the sun, but from a barber's quartz lamp, eager, bouncy, liking all that he saw, and running down the stairs to greet Colonnade. John! He didn't need to drive all the way down to meet me, but God help John if, as an employee, he hadn't been there. This is Dr. Bar-El, our pottery expert, Colonnade said. He knew how impressed businessmen were with the title doctor. They cursed professors, but they wanted their help to have doctorates. This is Dr. Ilan Eliav, and this is the top expert of them all, Jamal Tabari, Oxford University. Businessmen felt the same way about Oxford. Paul Zodman stepped back, surveyed his team, 3 good-looking, sunburned men, a beautiful woman, and said, You've got yourself a fine-looking group. I hope they know something. You cross-question them while I get your bags. 1 bag, Zodman explained, throwing Colonnade the ticket. A small overnighter. That also proved that he was Paul Zodman. He had learned that most travelers load themselves with preposterous amounts of luggage. When Colonnade got to the bag, he found it to be one of those super expensive fiberglass and magnesium jobs that weighed practically nothing. As a matter of interest, he asked the El Alman to put it on the scales, and fully loaded it hit just under 19 pounds. 2 Jews from New York struggled with 7 bags weighing nearly 200 pounds. On the trip back to the dig, Zodman suggested that he ride with Tabari and Eliav for the first half, and that he then change to Colonnade and Bar-El as the cars left the airport. Colonnade asked Verd, Well, I'm impressed. He's younger and smarter than I thought. Wait till you see how smart he is, Colonnade replied. They were permitted to do so at the halfway mark when Zodman jumped out of Eliav's car and came to Colonnade's. 2 excellent men, he said as he climbed in. I'd hire either of them for my stores right now. The Tabari is a shameless charmer, tried to snow me with flattery. Eliav's the powerhouse. You're paying them decent wages, John? Starvation, Baird replied. Well, if they're as good as they look, after 6 or 7 years, raise them $5. That goes for you too, Miss Barrell. Mrs. Barrell. This matter of wages on an archaeological dig is most perplexing, Solomon said. Since you've gone, John, I've had Miss Kramer get me the reports of all the important digs in this area. McAllister, Kenyon, Yadin, Albright. He rattled off some dozen names. You've read those reports? Barrett asked. The big folio volumes? The big, expensive volumes. I've spent almost as much on the books as I have on you. And John, he stopped, and there began the series of events which was to prove how stupid he could be. Do you suppose I could see the trees? What trees? Cullinane asked. I gave $81,000 to plant trees in this country. Well, Cullinane mumbled. Verad rescued him. The forests are over there, she said, waving generally toward the right. To distract Zodman, she began asking specific questions about the archaeological reports, discovering that he had not skimmed the books but was well versed in details. They never tell you what the expeditions cost, he complained. Correction. McAllister did say that to continue at Gazer would take about. He took out his wallet and, with no fumbling, produced a slip of paper from which he read at least 350 pounds per mensem would be requisite, and this does not allow any margin for extra expenses. That was in 1909. And what was the pound worth in 1909? About $5. That's 1,750 a month, $11,000 for a season. Now, McCoy is a lot smaller than Gazer was, yet you're charging me about $50,000 a season. How come? McAllister had only himself and Tabara's uncle, and they hired their diggers for 21 cents a day. On our payroll, the car had turned in the direction that Baird had indicated, and Zodman asked, Is this where the trees are? Down that way, Baird replied, seeking to sidetrack him. But soon the road turned that way, and Zodman asked, Now do I see the trees? Baird assured them that they were somewhere ahead, and in this way they reached the tell. But when Cullinane started to describe the Crusader castle, Zodman said quietly, You're going to think it's silly of me, but I'd like to see my trees. That castle died 1,000 years ago. The trees are living. Tabari took Eliev aside and warned him, Here we go again. You produce some trees or we're in trouble. Temporary relief was provided when Cullinane brought forth the gold menorah. This is your candlestick of death, he said, and for some minutes Zodman was lost in contemplation of that fateful object. Which was the candle where they cut off the king's head, he asked. The middle one, Tabari assured him. Eliev did not smile, for he was in trouble. Often before he had encountered this problem of the trees, for skilled Israeli collectors crisscrossing America for the Jewish Agency cajoled many wealthy American Jews into contributing dollars for reforesting the Holy Land. Imagine, the collectors wheedled, your trees going on land where King David lived. So when these donors reached Israel, the first thing they wanted to see was their trees. Paul Zodman had given $500,000 for buildings, but he had no desire to see them, for he knew that plaster and stone looked pretty much the same around the world. But a living tree growing from the soil of Israel was something which commanded his imagination. Unfortunately, Eliev had found a newly planted tree looked exactly like what it was, a wisp of potential growth with less than a 50% chance of living, and amicable relations between the new state of Israel and their Jewish friends in America had been damaged by this inability to show men like Zodman where their contributions had gone. Eliev had several times tried taking such donors to mountainsides where millions of fingerlings had been planted, but from a distance of even 20 feet, no living tree was visible. Some visitors never recovered from the shock. What we need is a ready-built forest, he whispered to Tabari, whereupon the Arab snapped his fingers. We've got one. Relax. Our problem is solved. What are you going to do? Eliev whispered. Mr. Zodman. Tomorrow, Tabari announced expansively. Tomorrow morning, you're going to see one of the finest forests. You're to call me Paul. You too, Mrs. Barrell. Tomorrow morning, Paul, I'm driving to see your trees. Could we possibly go now? No, Tabari said with firmness, and he was surprised at how easily Zodman accepted decisiveness. The Arab then took Cullinane aside and said, You got any quick-dry paint? A little. That cost a good deal. It could never be used for a finer purpose. What purpose? Eliev asked. I'm going to convert here and now the Ord Wingate Forest. Wait a minute. Those big trees? Paul Zodman will never know the difference, Tabari said, and that evening he painted an impressive sign The Paul J. Zotman Memorial Forest. After the paint had dried, the sign looked rather garish, so Tabari took it out to the tell and scuffed it about in the dig, after which he disappeared for the rest of the day. That evening, through a chain of misunderstandings, the dig almost collapsed. Trouble started when Paul Zodman, strolling away from headquarters at sunset, asked at Kibutznik, "Where is the synagogue, young man?" "Are you kidding?" The farmer laughed as he went off to milk his cows. Zodman returned to the office and complained to Eliab, "I arranged my flight so I'd arrive in Israel on Friday to attend prayers my first night. Now tell me, now they tell me the kibbutz doesn't have a synagogue." "This kibbutz no, but others do," Eliab temporized. Barrett asked, "Do you attend synagogue at home?" "No, but Jews who support Israel, well, we sort of expect." Vered was contemptuous of this reasoning and met it head on. "You expect us Israeli Jews to be more religious than you American Jews?" "Frankly, yes. You live in Israel. You have certain obligations. I live in America. I have other obligations." "Like making money?" Vered asked. Zodman realized that he was being foolish and lowered his voice. "I'm sorry if I raised embarrassing questions, but, Mrs. Barrell, your people do come pestering me every year for funds to keep Israel a Jewish state. And each year you send us a few dollars so we can be holy on your behalf." Zodman refused to lose his temper. "I'm afraid you've put it rather bluntly, but isn't that what we Jews have been doing for centuries? When my ancestors lived in Germany, men from the Holy Land came round each winter begging funds which would support religious Jews living in Tiberias and Zephath." "Days of charity are over," Barrett snapped. "A new kind of Jew lives in Israel." And Paul Zodman was about to meet one of them. As he sat down to dinner, he saw before him a tureen of soup, some chunky meat, some butter. He looked aghast at the combination of meat and butter and called for a waiter. He happened to get Schwartz, the kibbutz secretary. "Is this butter?" Zodman asked. With a bold forefinger, Schwartz took a dab of the butter, tasted it, wiped his finger on his t-shirt, and asked, "What else?" "Isn't this kibbutz kosher?" Schwartz looked at Zodman, then at Cullinane. In an American accent, he asked, "He some kind of nut or something?" He stopped a waiter and took from him a pitcher of cream. "Cream for your coffee?" he said contemptuously. Zodman ignored the gesture, but when Schwartz had moved along to another table, he said quietly, "Don't you find it extraordinary that this place is not kosher?" "Are you kosher at home?" Barrett asked unsympathetically. "No, but I expect Israel to be," she finished sardonically. Still, Zodman refused to grow angry. "I should think that a kibbutz, where young people are growing up," he shrugged his shoulders. Eliav offered concessions. "Our ships, airplanes, hotels, they're all kosher. Doesn't that reassure you?" Zodman did not reply, for he was truly disturbed by his discovery of a kibbutz that had no synagogue and a mess hall that was not kosher. It was Tabari, an Arab Muslim, who brought him consolation. "Paul, when you see your forest tomorrow." "His what?" Barrett asked. "His forest. I checked it this afternoon and it looks fine. After we see it, why don't we go to Zafat? It'll be Shabbat and we can attend the Vodsher Reb's synagogue." "Good idea," Eliav agreed. "Mr. Zodman, there you'll see the Israel you're searching for." But Zodman did not respond to the offer, and that night the group went to bed irritated and apprehensive. Zodman felt that he was wasting his money on a Jewish state that ignored synagogues and ritual. Colnane suspected that he might have lost his chief financial supporter. Eliav felt that, as an agent of the Israeli government, he should have been able to keep Zodman happy, and Vered remembered the American as an irritating fool, condescending in his attitude toward her country. She wished that he would leave so that the experts could get back to their jobs. Only Tabari was satisfied with that first day, and at midnight he came to Colnane's tent, wakened the American and Eliav, and offered them bottles of cold beer. "We're in real trouble," he said blithely, "but there's a way out. My Uncle Mahmoud knew more about digs than any man in Palestine, and he had one basic rule. The man who is putting up the money has got to be kept happy. Mahmoud always kept one major find buried under sand, so that when a visitor of importance arrived, he leaned back. By tomorrow night, we're going to have in Paul J. Zodman one of the world's happiest millionaires. Because you should see what my boys dug up this morning. It's hiding out there now with two guards watching it. Lie down, lie down." He rose and barred the exit. "Tomorrow morning, just as we drive off to the forest, Ranan from Budapest is going to come running up to my car shouting, 'Effendi, Effendi.'" "Effendi," Eliav growled. "He doesn't even know the word." And at the Paul J. Zodman Memorial Forest. I have a surprise for all of you, and when we get back from the Butcher Rebs, we'll have the biggest surprise of all. Let me say this, John. If you want more money from Zodman, ask for it tomorrow night. You'll get it. As Tabari had predicted, early next morning, when the cars were about to drive off, bow-legged Raanan hurried up, crying Effendi, Effendi at Trench A, and all piled out to see what the pigs had uncovered. Colonnade gasped. It was a fragment of Greek statuary, a rhythmic marble hand, so delicately poised as to make the heart pause in admiration. The hand grasped a strigil, the blade now broken but perfect in its relationship to the hand, and the two items, barely the 50th part of a complete statue, indicated what the whole must have been, just as the statue, if it were ever found, would epitomize the long struggle which stubborn Jews had conducted to protect their austere monotheism against the allurements of Greece. The statue of the Greek athlete had no doubt once adorned a gymnasium at Makor, the pagan center from which Greek officials had tried to impress their will on subject Jews, and as Colonnade sketched the find, he could hear the sophisticated philosophers from Athens arguing with the awkward Jews, who could hear the tempting rationalizations of those who followed Zeus and Aphrodite as they clashed against the immovable monotheism of the Jews, and he could visualize the struggle in which Hellenism, one of the most spontaneous civilizations in history, had tried to smother Judaism, one of the most rigid. How provocative it was to discover that the contest had reached even to Makor and had finally died away to the symbol of one athlete's hand grasping one broken strigil. You go on to Zavat, Colonnade called up from the trench. I'll work here. John, Tabari shouted, you're needed. And Colonnade was brought back to the present. He was needed, and the rest of the statue, if it lay buried in the tell, could wait. On one of the hills between Akko and Zafat, grateful Jews in 1949 had planted a small forest in memory of Ord Wingate, the understanding Englishman who had once served in Palestine and died in Burma. The trees had flourished and now showed substantial trunks and broad, spreading crowns. As the two cars pulled to a halt, the sign that proved this to be the Ord Wingate Forest was hidden, and a newer one, well scuffed, was in its place. The four archaeologists, somewhat ashamed of themselves, climbed down and tried to control their smiles as Zodman descended to inspect his forest. He stood for some minutes in the roadway, looking. Then, without speaking, he moved in among the trees, feeling their stout trunks and looking up at their piney needles. Some resin attached to his fingers, and he tasted it. He kicked at the earth and saw how humus had begun to form, and mulch that would hold water and prevent the floods that used to ravage this area. He turned to look back at the people who he was employing to dig at Makor, but his throat was too choked with emotion for him to speak. So he resumed his contemplation of the trees. At this point, Tabari had arranged for a troop of children to come running through the forest. None had been there for months, and their childish voices began to echo among the trees. Zodman turned with surprise as they ran past, and he caught a little girl, red-cheeked and pudgy. She knew no English, and he knew no Hebrew, but they looked at each other for a moment. Then she struggled to pull away, but Tabari had coached her, and now, over Zodman's shoulder, the Arab made a sign, and the child kissed the American. Zodman drew the little girl to him and bowed his head. He let her go, and she ran after the others to where a car would return them to their village. After a prolonged and painful interval, he came back to the cars and said haltingly, My relatives in Germany included many children. He wiped his eyes. It's a good thing to have children running free in a forest. He sat in the car, and for the rest of the trip said nothing. But Eliav found Tabari and whispered, Take that damn sign down. The Arab refused, pointing out, He'll go back to it again and again. They drove to Zafat, an exquisite town hanging in the hills, and as time for morning worship approached, Eliav explained, At the Vajr synagogue, no place is provided for women, so it would be best for Vera to wait in the car. Colonnade and Tabari aren't Jews, but I've brought yarmulkes for them, and they'll be welcomed. I've got a cap for you too, Mr. Zodman. He led the three worshippers away from the main street and down a series of steep, winding alleys that clustered along the sides of a hill. And sometimes these alleys were so narrow that Zodman could reach out and touch the houses on either side. Occasionally, the buildings joined in their second stories, and the men walked through tunnels, winding back and forth through the maze of history until Eliav pushed open a small door that led into a cramped room not more than 25 feet square. Along the sides stood stone benches hundreds of years old, and on them sat a collection of men who seemed even older. They were bearded, rheumy-eyed, and stooped. They wore long black coats and caps trimmed with fur. Some had prayer shawls of white wool striped with black. But they were primarily conspicuous because long and sometimes beautiful curls dangled beside their ears, and as they sat, they prayed, moving their bodies back and forth in a series of compulsive jerks. They were Hasidic Jews who gathered about the Reb of Vodz, a holy man who had emigrated from the Russian town of Vodz many years before, bringing with him these old men and others who were now dead. The infamous little man sat huddled by himself, wrapped in a prayer shawl, only his piercing blue eyes visible through a white beard and side curls. He was known as the Vodzer Reb, and this was his synagogue. But even more memorable was his beadle, a tall, cadaverous man with no teeth and a filthy robe, with a hem so stiff with dirt that it scraped the floor. He wore cracked shoes that squeaked as he made his way from one routine job to the next, and his fur cap was moth-eaten and bedraggled. As he led Eliav and his three guests to the benches, Eliav whispered, "When he asks you, Cohen or Levi, you reply Israel." And as soon as the four were seated, the pitiful beadle shuffled up to ask Cohen or Levi, and the men replied Israel. It would not be accurate to say that formal worship started. There were 17 men in the synagogue that morning, and each conducted his own service, coming together now and then as some special prayer was reached. But even then, they recited at 17 different speeds, so that the result was a mad jangle. During the service, the beadle shuffled back and forth, talking, cajoling, suggesting, while two old Jews sat in a corner conducting a business discussion. Two others prayed in loud voices on a line of their own, while the old Reb, incredibly ancient, Colnane thought, mumbled prayers that no one else could have heard. "I've been in some synagogues, but nothing like this," Colnane whispered to Eliab, who said, "Don't whisper, speak up." And Colnane said, above the rumble of voices, "Catholics aren't supposed to enter other churches." And Zodman said, "This isn't a church, it's a synagogue." In the middle of the service, the old beadle went to the niche where the Torah was kept, those first 5 books of the Bible ascribed to Moses. And as the silver tasseled scroll was brought forth, old men kissed it reverently. The beadle carried it to a kind of pulpit where a reader began chanting the holy words. No one listened except that time to time the beadle summoned different members of the congregation to stand beside the chanter, honorary readers as it were. "He takes first a Cohen, then a Levi, then an Israel," Eliav said above the noise. "What are they?" Colnane asked. "I'll explain later," he replied. And then the beadle was at Colnane's elbow, tugging at Paul Zodman's sleeve, and it was apparent that the Chicagoan was being asked to assist at the reading of the Torah. And suddenly, the whole significance of the day was altered. Tears came into the millionaire's eyes. He looked in bewilderment at Colnane and Eliav, who pushed him forward. He went to the rickety pulpit, where the reader, using a silver wand, pointed out the words on the scroll, and over the man's shoulder, Zodman looked at the ancient Hebrew characters. Recollections of his grandfather reciting these words came to him, recollections of the little German town of Graz, from which he had sprung. The drone of voices in the Vodzer synagogue was like an orchestration of his ancestral memories, and when, at the end of the reading, the beadle asked in Yiddish how much Zodman would contribute to the synagogue, the latter said in a low voice, $200. 600 lira, the beadle shouted to the worshippers, and all stopped to look at Zodman, even the Reb himself, and the American returned to his seat, sitting very quietly throughout the rest of the service. Colnane, used to the rigid formalism of Catholic worship, with its masterful alternation of priestly chant and group participation, was unable to assess the Jewish ritual. Here there was no organization, no systematic division, and no apparent beauty. The voices of women were absent. The beadle shuffled up and down. The old Reb prayed on his own, and each man was his separate synagogue. He looked at the two men in the corner, still arguing their business problem, and he concluded that while Judaism might be meaningful for Paul Zodman, it could never substitute for the controlled beauty of Catholicism. Then, just as he was dismissing the religion, a moment arrived that he would never forget, one of the supreme religious experiences of his life. In later years, as he dug through the layers of Jewish history at Makor, it would return at unexpected time to illuminate his understanding. It started simply. The beadle shuffled up to an old man sitting beside Zodman and indicated that he must take off his shoes. The old Jew did so, and the beadle banged his way to a little closet under the niche, and while the others prayed, he rattled a chain of keys, finally selecting one that unlocked the closet doors, behind which hung a copper pot. This he handed to the man, who went to a spigot outside the door as the beetle threw down a narrow rug. Three other men took off their shoes, and when the first returned with water, washed their hands. 4 white prayer shawls were then procured, and these the 4 shoeless men threw over their heads, not their shoulders, their heads, and took their places on the rug, where they prayed in silence, facing the wall. Now the Vodjer Reb began a different kind of chant, composed of short phrases, whereupon the 4 beshrouded Jews turned to face the congregation, and bowing from the waist, extended their arms to form a kind of cloth tent, which hid their faces but allowed their voices to sound forth. And from this strange position they uttered a series of moving cries, meaningless but profound. Cullinane stared at the ghostly figures, these headless Jews lost in their shrouds, and wondered what their performance could signify. It was archaic, passionate, a group of voices shouting some message from the most ancient history of man. And finally the shawls were dropped back over the heads, and the voices ceased. The ceremony, whatever it was, had ended, and 17 different men moaned and grumbled and argued their way to the conclusion of 17 different services. The Reb mumbled a prayer, and the synagogue service ended. What was it? Cullinane asked, deeply shaken by the last segment of the service. The shawl thing? Eliab asked. All Jews are divided among Cohens, Levites, and Israels. Cohens are priests, Levites are the temple attendants, and Israels are the majority that's left over. At each Saturday service, Cohens in attendance, they don't have to be named Cohen, though many are, rise, put on their shawls, and bless the congregation. Zodman looks as if he has taken it seriously. So do you, Eliab said. Zodman left the Vodjer synagogue in a state of euphoria, relieved to know that Israel had some persons, at least, who sustained Jewish ritual, and when the men returned to the cars where Vered waited, he stunned them by stating solemnly, I don't think it's right to drive on Shabbat, and he would not allow the cars to move until the holy day ended. Has he ever done such a thing in Chicago? Vered whispered. No, he loves college football, drives to Urbana every Saturday. I believe, Zodman pronounced gravely, that with enough saintly men like the Vodjer Rebbe, Israel is in good hands. Enough men like the Reb, Vered whispered, and this country is doomed. Since the cars could not be used, Cullinane walked his group to a hotel that had old olive trees in the court, and there, over a cold lunch, since no fires were allowed in Zafat on Shabbat, the archaeologists explained to their patron what they were accomplishing in Makor. Let's climb up on the hill, Cullinane suggested. I can show you there. We won't have to use the cars, Zodman asked suspiciously. Walking is allowed, Eliab assured him, for 2,000 paces in each direction, and the 5 climbed to the top of the hill, crowning Safat, where they found the ruins of a Crusader castle. Zodman was delighted to see the great rocks and asked, will ours look as good as this? Better, Cullinane assured him, because Makor was a better castle to begin with, and I think we're going to uncover more of it. But you understand, Paul, that when we do uncover it, we'll have to remove many of the stones and go down to levels beneath. What happens to the castle? Zodman asked. Some of it vanishes, stone by stone. But I gave the money to find a castle. You will, but the important finds will be the ones underneath, the ones going far back into history. Zodman frowned. I sort of fancied that when we were through, we'd have a castle. So when my friends came over from Chicago, I could send them up to, well, see my castle. Cullinane took the next step cautiously. In Israel, we have half a dozen good Crusader castles. Here, the one at Starkenberg, but what we're digging for may be nowhere else. The ultimate secrets of Jewish history. This was a preposterous statement, but it sounded good. Tabari added, the sort of thing you saw at the Vodjer Rebs. This was completely nonsensical, but as Tabari had guessed, it had caught Zodman's attention, his imagination. You think there's something worthwhile down there, beneath the castle? Where we're standing, here at Zafat, history goes back to the time of Flavius Josephus, about the time of Christ. But at Makor, it may go back an additional 7,000 or 8,000 years. Like Gezer? Zalman asked. Jericho? Like them, Kulinain said. Maybe not as far, Eliav said with professional caution. But there's a chance? Zalman asked. Correct, Tabari said. A treasure house of Jewish history. Then we should dig for it, Zalman said, even if I must lose some of my castle. We'd better get in the cars now, Tabari insinuated, because I have something quite special arranged for tonight. Zodman consulted his watch and his conscience and said, I think it's now all right to travel. But when the cars reached his memorial forest and Tabari asked, Do you want to stop and see your trees again? He replied, I think we can let the trees go back to their rightful owner. You see, when I was playing with those phony little children, I saw the other Ord Wingate sign, which somebody overlooked. For a moment, no one knew what to say, but Tabari broke the silence with the breezy observation, Tonight, Paul, you're going to see something you'll never forget. I'll never forget the forest, Zodman replied, and they could not tell whether he was joking or not. In Israel, the festive night of the week is Saturday, for when 3 stars can be seen in the heavens at one glance, Shabbat ends, and the Orthodox who have observed its restrictions are free to travel and to celebrate. On this Saturday night, Kibbutz Makor was playing host to the Galilee finals of the biennial Bible quiz, in which participants were subjected to the most penetrating questions regarding Old Testament history. Winners of tonight's contest would move on to Jerusalem to qualify for the World Finals, in which many countries would participate. So excitement was high as buses arrived in the kibbutz from Akko, Zephon, and Tiberias. Before the contest began, Tabari asked permission to address the crowd and said, Tonight, our contestants will compete not only for the right to go to Jerusalem, but for cash prizes, which our distinguished guest from America, Mr. Paul Zodman, has agreed to award. Zodman, knowing nothing of this plan, fidgeted uneasily as the shameless Arab stared at him and said, First prize, 100 American dollars. Zodman nodded and the crowd cheered. Second prize, $50. Third prize, 25. He smiled blandly at Zodman and sat down. The Chicagoan had expected the evening to be a perfunctory affair, but he was soon disabused. 12 Israelis, mostly under the age of 30, lined up while a group of 4 experts from Jerusalem began firing questions at them. Name 7 birds mentioned in the Bible, citing your authority for each. That gave no difficulty, nor did the call for 7 animals. Name 3 princesses from outside Israel who caused trouble. A young man from Tiberias answered that one. Differentiate between the 3 Isaiahs and distribute the book of Isaiah among them. That knocked out one girl who knew the difference between the first Isaiah, who was purely Jewish in his theology, and the second, who seemed to foretell the Christian faith, but not the third Isaiah, a shadowy figure who returned to Hebraic thoughts. The next woman, a Yemenite from Zephat, was able to answer the question and specify chapters and verses at which the Isaiahs were separated. At the end of the second hour, 3 contestants still remained, 2 men and an attractive girl from Kibbutz Makor, and the questions became minute. Differentiate between Judea, Jedida, and Jeduthun, citing your authority for each. That took care of one man, but the girl was able to rattle off the answers. In the end, she defeated the other man as well, to the joy of her kibbutzniks. Young lady, Zodman said with respect, I have never seen a person win a prize more deservedly than you have just done. That goes for you too, gentlemen. But I would like to ask one additional question. Was this a hand-picked group? Do the other young people know the Bible as well as you did? Excuse me, Schwartz interrupted, collecting the girls' $100, for the kibbutz was run on a basis of pure socialism. In Israel, we all study the Bible. From our kibbutz alone, we could have offered a team which would have done just as well. Amazing, Zodman said. And that night, before he went to bed, he intended to tell Kulinain that he was thinking more kindly about Israel, even if the kibbutz didn't have a synagogue. But he found his director sitting silently before the Greek hand with the strigel, so he did not interrupt. But when Vered Bar El appeared, he walked with her beneath the olive trees, confessing, I'm afraid I was fairly stupid about your Israel. I was sure you couldn't have been as ill-informed as you sounded yesterday, she said. Next morning, there was much energy at the dig, for Tabari had promised an extra £10 to any worker who turned up a significant find while Paul Zodman was on the premises, and before noon, a girl at Trench B started crying, I win, I win. Shut up, Tabari cried, quieting the cries, lest Zodman hear. But when he saw what the girl had unearthed, a Babylonian helmet with a spear point bespeaking the days when Nebuchadnezzar had enslaved Makor and taken into captivity much of its population, he himself became excited and started shouting, Hey, everyone! And in the confusion, Zodman came running up to see the mysterious armor, which must have struck terror into ancient Makor. when its owner stalked into town. Cullinane sketched the find and then turned the trench over to the reporters. On his way back to the office, he saw with apprehension that the team at Trench A was gouging out the earth with unscientific haste, and no doubt destroying minor objects. He protested to Tabari, but the Arab said, "We've got 10 years to impress scholars, and one morning to impress Paul J. Zodman. If I had a steam shovel right now, I'd use it." And his scheme proved profitable when a boy from Trench A turned up one of the real finds at the tell. "What is it?" Zodman asked. "The most Hebrew thing we've found yet," Cullinane explained. "The kind of horned altar they speak of in the Bible. This could date back to the time of King David. He may even have worshipped at it, although I doubt he was ever here." Zodman bent in the dust to study the old stone altar, so strange and barbaric, yet the foundation of so much of Jewish religion, the kind of altar at which the first sacrifices were made to the one God. Tenderly he patted the antique piece, then said, "I'm flying out tonight to Rome." "But you've been here only 2 days," Cullinane protested. "Can't give you any more time," the busy man said. On the way to the airport, he observed to Vered and Cullinane, "These 2 days were worth 2 years of my life. I saw something I'll never forget." "The Vojer Reb?" Vered asked, with just a touch of malice. "No, an Israeli soldier." Silence, deep silence. Then Zodman's quiet voice. "For 2,000 years, whenever we Jews saw a soldier, it could only mean bad news, because the soldier couldn't be Jewish. He had to be an enemy. It's no small thing to see a Jewish soldier standing on his own soil, protecting Jews, not persecuting them." More silence. At the airport, Zodman assembled his staff and said, "You're doing a wonderful job. Last night, after I talked with Mrs. Barrell, I surrendered my sentimental interest in the castle. Go on down to bedrock. You're a great team and you can do it." He hesitated, then pointed at Tabari. "But this one, John, I think you should fire." Vered gasped as Zodman, without changing his austere expression, said, "Lacks the scientific attitude, doesn't pay attention to details." "His uncle Mahmoud," Cullinane stammered. "Not only did the Ord Wingate Forest have 2 signs," Zodman said, "but that first night, while you men were plotting in the tent, I took a walk on the tell, and a guard cried, 'You can't go there.' And when I asked why not, he said, 'Because Mr. Tabari is keeping a piece of the Greek statue buried in the sand so that tomorrow he can please some jerk from Chicago.' And he was gone." As the plane roared off, its jet engines so reminiscent of the passenger they were bearing aloft, Vered Bar El sighed. "In Israel, there's bitter discussion about why American Jews refuse to emigrate here. At last I understand. We couldn't find room for more than 1 or 2 like him." She looked at Cullinane quizzically, and he said, "America's a big place. We can absorb all sorts of energy." And on the long ride back to Makor, he again asked Vered why she and Eliab were not married, and she replied cautiously, "Life in Israel is not altogether simple. Being a Jew is not always easy." On that subject, she obviously preferred to say no more. Cullinane remarked, "You didn't see the Vojer Reb and his team, but you can imagine." "I used to know the Reb," she said cryptically. "Side curls, fur hat, long cloak. Frenzy. That's part of the burden we carry. Why do Jews make things so difficult for themselves and others?" Cullinane asked. "What I mean is this. We Catholics are holding ecumenical conferences to minimize the archaic structure of our religion, while you Israelis seem to be doing everything to make yours more archaic. What's the reason? You're looking at the old Jews in the Vojer synagogue. Why not look at the young Jews at the kibbutz? They refuse to fool around with archaic forms, but they know the Bible better than any Catholic you've ever met. They study it not to find religious forms, but to discover the organic basis of Judaism. I think, John, that it's in our young people that we find our answers, not in the old Rebs." "I wish I were as sure as you are," he said. Then, unexpectedly, he gained a series of rapid insights into kibbutz life and discovered for himself reasons that supported Vered's belief that the salvation of Israel probably rested in the idealism and dedication generated by the kibbutz. It was a Friday night, and he had returned to the dig after participating in the evening service at the synagogue in Akko. As he sat at his table in the mess hall, he saw coming out of the kitchen, working as a waiter, a man whose face he recognized. It was the strong, vital face of a man in his mid-40s. His steel-gray hair was cropped short in the German fashion, and he had no left arm, his shirt sleeve having been pinned up tight with a safety pin. He was General Teddy Reich, one of the heroes of Israel's War of Independence and now a cabinet minister. For 2 years, he had been the Israeli ambassador to the United States. and was well known in America, where he had proved himself a witty and successful diplomat. But more than soldier, diplomat, or statesman, Teddy Reich was a member of Kibbutz Makor, and from it he derived his strength. He had helped establish this communal settlement and had organized its economy and its rules of living. He owned not a penny's worth of property in the world, only his share in the kibbutz, and frequently throughout the year he came back from Jerusalem to attend the policy-making Friday night sessions. Whenever he did so, he worked in the kitchen with one arm to show the younger members what he had discovered in the long years when Jews had no homeland. That work, productive work, is the salvation of man, and especially of the Jew. He brought a platter of meat to the archaeologist's table and said to Eliav, "Could I see you in the kitchen?" Colonel noticed that Vered watched Eliav go as if she were an apprehensive mother hen, but when she caught Colonel observing her, she laughed nervously. "They say Teddy Reich's backing Eliav for some important job." "In the government?" the Irishman asked. "Ben Gurion considered him one of our brightest young men," she said, and Colonel thought she speaks of him as if he were her neighbor's boy, unattached to her in any way. In the kitchen, Eliav and Reich spent some hours talking politics while the general washed dishes, but when the kibbutz meeting convened, Reich absented himself and came to the headquarters building seeking Colonel. "Could we talk for a moment?" the one-armed cabinet member asked. Colonel was pleased at the opportunity, and Reich said, "Mind if we walk back to the kibbutz? I want you to meet someone." And for the first time, in summery moonlight, Colonel actually visited the kibbutz at which he had been impersonally taking his meals. He saw the buildings, which men like Reich had wrenched from the soil, the small homes for nearly 1,500 people, the wealth accumulated through years of communal work, the schools, the nurseries, the hospital. To walk past these living buildings occupying land at lain barren for nearly 750 years was an experience that made the state of Israel come alive. And Colonel listened attentively as Reich explained the rationale for this move or that. But finally, the former general said, "What I really wanted to talk with you about is the possibility of getting my daughter into the University of Chicago." "Can be done if she's a good student." "I think she is, but I want you to judge." "She live here? In the kibbutz?" "Where else?" Reich led the way to a series of dormitory buildings, where he knocked on one of the doors, waiting for a girl's voice that advised him in Hebrew to come in. When the door was pushed open, Colonel saw a beautiful young girl of 17 or 18, and like a schoolboy, he pointed at her. "You won the Bible quiz." "Yes," she nodded gracefully, and indicated 4 iron beds where they could sit. Colonel sat on one and told Reich, "You don't need to worry about her getting into the university. In Bible, she knows more than the professors." "But does she know enough English?" Colonel began speaking with the charming young woman, and after several exchanges said, "Heavy accent, but she certainly knows enough to get by." "I hope so," Reich said. "I could have sent her to the Reali in Haifa. They offered a scholarship, but I thought it more important for her to know kibbutz life, even if the school here isn't first class." "It's an excellent school," the girl protested. "In academics subjects, it's rotten," Reich said. And before his daughter could object, he held up his right hand. "Rotten, but she's found herself a good education nevertheless." He was about to discuss entrance requirements when the door burst open, admitting a rugged young fellow of about 18, dressed only in shorts and with a face full of shaving lather. He seemed to belong in the room, for after apologizing to General Reich and nodding brusquely to Koenig, he went to the bed next to the girls and fumbled about in a locker, looking for his razor. When he finally found it, he handled it gravely, like a young man who has not shaved regularly, and after further apologies, backed out. "Your son?" Koenig asked. "No," Reich said. Koenig was left hanging. Obviously, the young man lived in this room. Obviously, Reich's daughter lived in it too. He looked at her fingers, finding no wedding ring, and he must have blushed, for suddenly Reich burst into laughter. Oh, the young man. His daughter laughed too, and Colonel felt embarrassed at a joke which he failed to understand. "Here at Kibbutz Makor," Reich explained, "we decided from the first that our children would be brought up outside the home. So while they're still babies, we take 2 boys from 2 different families and 2 girls from 2 other families and put them together in one room. And they stay together till they're 18. "You mean?" "Yes," the general said. "In this bed, my daughter, in that one, the young man you just saw. Where you're sitting, another girl, and over there, another boy." Colonel gulped. "Till 18? That's a natural stopping age," Rex said. 18, everyone goes off to the army. There, the boys and girls meet other people their own age, and they get married quite normally." "They don't." Colonel could scarcely frame his question. What you mean, the girl said easily, is that we almost never marry boys from our own kibbutz. We know them far too well. Conan looked at the proximity of the beds and said, I suppose so. As for the other problem that worries you, the lovely girl went on, I've lived here at Makor for 18 years, and in that time we've had only 2 pregnancies and 1 abortion. In our grammar school, when I was in Washington, we had 10 times that many in 1 year, and the girls there were only 14. Suddenly, in the small room, Conan could see his sister in suburban Chicago. The silly woman had 3 daughters, and at 13, each had become, under her tutelage, a premature Cleopatra, with lipstick permanent and some pimply-faced teenage boy as her steady date. The youth of his nieces had been a fleeting thing, and at 16 each had begun carrying in her purse a flat tin box of contraceptives in case her escort had forgotten. It was difficult for him to comprehend what Teddy Reich and his daughter were saying, that there was a different way of rearing children, one that worked at least as well as the preposterous system now being followed in America. His reflections were halted when the young man returned to his room, clean-shaven but still in his shorts. With some awkwardness he dressed and ran off to a meeting being held in the schoolhouse. Tell them I'll be along in a minute, Reich's daughter cried. Then she turned to Conan and asked, Do you think I'm ready for Chicago? More than ready, he assured her. And you'll help with my application? I'd be proud to sponsor you. The girl left, and the 2 men sat alone in the room. Do you find it so incredible? Reich asked, not waiting for an answer from the stunned archaeologist. He said, The results of our system are striking. No juvenile delinquency, none. A minimum of sexual aberration. Of course, we have our share of adultery and backbiting, but our success in marriage, far above normal. And when they become adults, they have the sturdy drive we need in Israel. But living together till 18, Reich laughed and said, I knew a lot of psychotics in America who'd have been much better off if they'd lived that way in their youth. Saved them from a hell of a lot of mental disturbances. Conan wondered if Reich was alluding to him, a man in his 40s and not yet married. Perhaps things would have worked out differently if he had shared a room with girls in his normal way until he was 18. But these speculations were ended when Reich said, We kibbutzniks represent only about 4% of the total population of Israel, but we have supplied about 50% of the national leadership in all fields, because we grew up with honest ideals, solid underpinning. He rattled off the names of Israel's notable leaders, and all were old kibbutzniks. And none of these men own anything, Conan asked. What do you own, really? Reich countered. Your education, your force of character, your family. Do you really own the other things? Or do they own you? But as they walked back to the archaeological headquarters, Reich confessed, each year the kibbutz percentage of the total population, diminishes. Today, people are no longer interested in our ideals, only in making a fast buck. He shook his head sadly. So much the worse for Israel. And in a gloomy frame of mind, he walked back through the buildings he had created with one arm. September came, and the dig settled down to great, serious work before it. And we'll stop there for now.